Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight's story is called, The Only Rule Is, Don't Fall Asleep. The hum of the engine was a hypnotic drone, a monotonous lullaby in the vast, crushing darkness of the interstate. For Liam, it was the only thing keeping the world from dissolving into a smear of black asphalt and fleeting white lines. His eyelids felt like they were lined with sandpaper, each blink a monumental effort. 300 miles down, maybe 200 to go. He thought he could make the drive from his college campus back to his parents' place in one straight shot. It seemed like a brilliant idea at 2 in the afternoon. Now, at what his dashboard clock claimed was nearly 2 in the morning, it felt like the single dumbest decision of his entire 21 years. He cranked the volume on the radio, hoping a blast of generic pop music would jolt his tired brain. The speakers crackled with static before a weak signal fought through. It wasn't music. It was a talk show, the host's voice a syrupy, late-night drawl. Liam didn't care. It was a human voice, and right now that was enough. He took a long swallow from a lukewarm energy drink, the chemical sweetness doing little to cut through the exhaustion fogging his mind. He was driving his beat-up 2008 sedan, a car he'd affectionately named the Millennium Falcon, for its tendency to fall apart at the worst possible moments. And right on cue, as if summoned by the thought, the car gave a violent shudder. The engine coughed, a sick metallic sputtering sound that made Liam's stomach clench. The headlights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging him into absolute blackness save for the faint glow of the moon. The car coasted for another 100 feet, its momentum bleeding away until it rolled to a dead stop on the shoulder of the empty highway. No, you can't do this to me, Liam muttered, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. He turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. He tried again. Silence. The talk show host was gone, replaced by an oppressive quiet that was louder than any noise. He was stranded. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. It was the perfect trifecta of bad luck. For a few minutes, he just sat there, the full weight of his situation pressing down on him. The highway was deserted. He hadn't seen another car for at least half an hour. Panic began to prickle at the edges of his exhaustion. He knew he had two choices, stay in the car and wait for a miracle, or start walking. He peered through the windshield into the gloom. Up ahead, maybe a mile or two away, he could see a faint, hazy glow against the sky. A town. It wasn't much, but it was a destination. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed his jacket, his wallet, and his phone, which was now just a useless brick, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The walk was surreal. The silence of the highway was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of his sneakers on the gravel shoulder and the distant chirping of crickets. The town's glow grew steadily brighter, resolving into the distinct hum of streetlights. He eventually came to an exit ramp with a single, weathered green sign. It read, Havenwood. Population 987. Havenwood. The name sounded peaceful, quaint. The reality was different. As he walked down what appeared to be the main street, a profound sense of wrongness washed over him. The streetlights cast a buzzing, sterile, almost orange light over everything, but all the shops were dark. Not just closed for the night, but dark in a more permanent way. Some had plywood over the windows. Every house he passed had its curtains drawn shut, thick and heavy. There were no lights on inside, no flickering blue glow of a television screen. It was a town holding its breath. He was about to give up and resign himself to a night spent on a park bench when he saw it. At the far end of the street, a single beacon of life, a flickering neon sign that read, Havenwood Diner, open 24 hours. Relief washed over him so intensely his knees felt weak. A 24-hour diner meant coffee. It meant a telephone. It meant people. He pushed open the glass door, a small bell tinkling overhead, announcing his arrival. The inside was a snapshot from another era. Red vinyl booths, a long formica countertop with chrome-rimmed stools, and the faint, lingering smell of stale coffee and fried bacon. The place was empty, except for one person. A young woman, probably his age, stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened slightly. They were the first thing he noticed because they were alarmingly bloodshot, framed by dark, bruised-looking circles. She looked more exhausted than he felt, and he had just driven for 8 hours straight. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, strained. "Yeah, I hope so," Liam said, sliding onto a stool. "My car broke down on the interstate a couple miles back. My phone's dead. Is there a mechanic in town? Or a tow service I could call?" The woman, whose name tag read Chloe, stared at him for a long moment. She wasn't looking at him so much as she was looking through him. Her focus was distant, her movements jittery. "Tow truck won't come out till morning," she said flatly, her eyes darting towards the large plate glass window that looked out onto the empty street. Nothing moves out there after dark.
Oh.
Okay, Liam said, a little taken aback by her tone. Well, is there a motel? Anywhere I can stay for the night? At the word night, a flicker of something, fear, maybe, crossed her face. She stopped wiping the counter and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You don't want to do that. You don't want to sleep here. Liam blinked. I'm sorry. You heard me, she said, her gaze intense, locking onto his. Look, you can stay here. I'll make you coffee, as much as you can drink. You can have whatever you want to eat, on the house. But you can't go to sleep. Not in Havenwood. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. Is this some kind of small-town prank you play on strangers? Because I'm really not in the mood. I'm so tired I can barely see straight. This isn't a joke, she hissed, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. What's the last thing you remember seeing on that sign coming into town? The name? Havenwood. Under that. Liam thought for a second. The population. 900 and something. Population 987, she corrected, her voice trembling slightly. It's been 987 for 3 years. Last week, old Mr. Abernathy, he was 89, had a heart attack in his garden. We all saw it. The coroner came. He was gone. The next morning, the sign on the edge of town read, Population 986. But that night his nephew fell asleep on his porch swing. Just for an hour. When the sun came up, the sign was back to 987. And we had a new mailman. Looked a bit like Abernathy's nephew, but his eyes were wrong. He didn't know anyone's name. Liam stared at her, utterly bewildered. He felt like he had stumbled into the middle of a play where he was the only one who didn't know his lines. This woman was either crazy or on something. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, he said slowly. There's only one rule in this town, she said, her voice barely audible, raw with a fear so palpable it felt like a physical force in the quiet diner. It's the only thing that matters. The only thing that keeps us. She leaned in closer, the smell of stale coffee on her breath. Don't fall asleep. Liam stared at Chloe, the silence in the diner stretching thin and taut like a wire about to snap. Her words hung in the air, absurd and yet delivered with a chilling sincerity that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up. Don't fall asleep. It was the kind of thing you'd hear in a horror movie, not from a terrified waitress in the middle of nowhere. His exhausted brain struggled to process it, trying to fit her story into a logical framework. A cult. Some kind of mass hysteria. You can't be serious, he finally managed to say, his voice a dry croak. People get replaced? Like an invasion of the body snatchers. He meant it as a joke, a way to puncture the tension, but Chloe didn't even crack a smile. I don't know what that is, she said, her eyes scanning the dark street outside again. I just know what happens. 1 minute, it's your friend, your neighbor, your husband. They nod off, maybe just for a few minutes in a chair. When they open their eyes, they look the same. They walk and talk. But they're a copy. A bad one. The little things are gone. The way they used to laugh at your stupid jokes, the memories you shared, it's all wiped clean. They're just empty. A scraping sound from a booth in the corner made Liam jump. He hadn't noticed the old man sitting there, huddled over a steaming mug. The man was rail-thin, with a wild shock of white hair and eyes that darted around the room as if expecting an attack. He was clutching his coffee mug like a holy relic. She's telling you the truth, son, the old man rasped, his voice like gravel. Listen to her. The girl's smart. She survived this long. He took a noisy sip from his mug. Name's Arthur. I've been awake for, what is it now, Chloe? 6 days. 7, Arthur, Chloe corrected softly. Your daughter is bringing your next supply run at sunrise. 7 days, Arthur repeated, a grim pride in his voice. You see these hands? He held them up, and Liam could see they were trembling violently. That's not old age. That's the price. Your body screams for it. Your mind begs for it. But you can't give in. You can't ever give in. Liam shook his head, running a hand through his greasy hair. I'm sorry, I can't believe this. There has to be a rational explanation. Was it rational when the cell towers all went dead 3 years ago? Not a single bar of service for 100 miles in any direction. Arthur challenged. Was it rational when the birds stopped singing? Did you hear any birds when you walked into town, son? Any crickets? Anything? Liam froze. The old man was right. The walk from his car had been silent. Eerily so. He hadn't consciously registered it at the time, but the usual soundtrack of the rural night, the chirps, the rustling, the hum of life, had been completely absent. The only sound had been his own footsteps and the low buzz of the streetlights. They don't like noise, Chloe added, her voice low. The new ones. The replacements. They prefer the quiet. That's why the town is like this. We learned early on. Stay quiet. Stay inside. And stay awake. The sheer weight of his exhaustion was making it hard to think straight. Every logical part of his brain was screaming that these people were delusional, feeding each other's paranoia in their isolated little town. But the fear in their eyes was genuine. And the silence outside was real. Okay, Liam said, trying to placate them, to play along until he could figure a way out. Okay, no sleeping. I get it. Can I please have some coffee? A look of relief passed over Chloe's face. Of course. She turned and pulled a glass pot from a burner, the coffee within it a thick, black sludge. She poured it into a heavy ceramic mug and pushed it across the counter toward him. It smelled burnt and bitter, but it was hot. He wrapped his cold hands around it, the warmth a small comfort in the creeping dread that was beginning to feel all too real. He took a sip. It was awful, tasting like acid and tar, but he felt the caffeine hit his system almost immediately, a welcome jolt that sharpened the edges of his blurry world. So what do you do? He asked, trying to keep the conversation going, to keep his mind occupied. You just drink coffee all night? At first, yeah, Arthur chimed in from his booth. We nearly ran out of coffee and energy drinks in the first month. We had to get organized. We have shifts now. The Watchers. We patrol in pairs, making sure no one's lights are out. We check on the elderly. We deliver supplies. Anything to keep each other going. During the day, it's a little easier. The sun, it seems to keep the worst of it at bay. But we still don't sleep. We just rest. Sit quietly, maybe read a book. You can let your body rest, but you can't let your mind switch off. Not for a second. Liam looked from Arthur's shaking hands to Chloe's deep-set, dark-ringed eyes. He saw the toll this constant vigilance had taken on them. They were living ghosts, haunted by the specter of sleep itself. He thought about the boarded-up windows he'd seen. They weren't to keep burglars out. They were to keep the replacements from looking in. Or maybe, to keep the terrified residents from having to see the empty faces of their former loved ones walking the silent streets. So what happens at sunrise? Liam asked. Things get normal-ish, Chloe said. The replacements, they go about their day. They pretend. They'll mow their lawns or sweep their porches. But if you try to talk to them, they'll just smile. A blank, empty smile. They don't start conversations. They don't remember you. They're just going through the motions. Waiting for the sun to go down again. Waiting for someone else to make a mistake. Liam drank more of the terrible coffee, the caffeine and adrenaline a potent cocktail in his veins. He was wide awake now, but it was a brittle, frantic kind of wakefulness. He felt a desperate need to get out, to get back to his car, to flag down a truck driver who hadn't heard of Havenwood and its impossible rule. He spent the next hour listening to their stories. Arthur spoke of his wife, Martha. She had fallen asleep in her armchair watching television one evening. He'd only been in the kitchen for 5 minutes. When he came back, she was awake, folding the laundry that had been in the basket. But she didn't recognize the locket he had given her on their 50th anniversary. She just smiled her new, vacant smile and kept folding. Arthur had left his home of 60 years that night and had been living in the back of the diner ever since. The diner's bell tinkled, and Liam's heart leaped into his throat. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside, but he didn't look like any cop Liam had ever seen. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was pale and drawn. He gave Liam a quick, suspicious glance before turning his exhausted eyes to Chloe. "Everything quiet tonight, Chloe?" the sheriff asked, his voice weary. "So far, Sheriff Thompson," she replied. "This is Liam. Car trouble." The sheriff nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Liam. "You picked a bad night to break down, son. You listen to what she tells you. You understand. Don't be a hero. Don't be a skeptic. Just stay awake." He took a thermos she offered him from behind the counter, nodded once to Arthur, and left without another word. The brief encounter left Liam shaken. This wasn't just two paranoid civilians. This was the law. The entire town was in on it. The conspiracy, the psychosis, whatever it was total. And then, the exhaustion he'd been fighting back returned with a vengeance. It was a physical wave, so powerful it made his head swim. His focus blurred. The hum of the diner's refrigerator seemed to grow impossibly loud, then fade into a dull roar. His head felt heavy, his chin dipping toward his chest. Just for a second, a voice whispered in his mind. A seductive, treacherous voice that came from the deepest, most tired part of his soul. Just close your eyes for a second. It won't hurt. His eyelids fluttered, then closed. For a blissful, infinite instant, there was nothing. No fear, no bitter coffee, no humming lights. Just a deep, velvety blackness. A peaceful, welcoming void. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his hand. His eyes flew open. Chloe was standing over him, having just jabbed his hand with the tines of a fork. Not hard enough to break the skin, but enough to send a shock of pain through his system. Arthur was half out of his booth, his face a mask of pure terror. They were both staring at him, their chests heaving, their eyes wide with a fear that was far more intense than before. "Don't you ever do that again," Chloe breathed, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We saw your eyes roll back. You were gone, Liam. For a second, you were gone." Liam looked down at his hand, then back at their terrified faces. He hadn't been dreaming. He hadn't seen anything. It had been just a moment of blackness. But to them, it was a near catastrophe. And in their shared panic, a terrifying new thought wormed its way into his mind, cold and sharp. What if they weren't wrong? What if, in that single peaceful second of darkness, something had almost gotten in? The sting of the forked tines in the back of his hand was a grounding, painful reality. Liam snatched his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The peaceful, velvety blackness he had touched for a fleeting second was gone, replaced by a stark, chemical and caffeine-fueled terror. It wasn't just Chloe and Arthur's horrified expressions that scared him. It was the memory of that void. It had felt too good, too welcoming. What did you see?" Liam stammered, his voice thin. "Your face," Arthur whispered from his booth, his shaking hands now deathly still. "It went blank. Utterly and completely blank. Like a doll's face. No stress, no exhaustion, no anything. Just a mask." "Your breathing stopped," Chloe added, her own voice ragged. She hadn't lowered the fork. She held it now like a weapon, its prongs pointed at him. It wasn't like you were holding your breath. It just ceased. For that 1 second, you were just a thing sitting on that stool. You weren't in there anymore. The implication was horrifying. The change wasn't just mental. It was physical, instantaneous. A switch being flipped. The fear that had been a dull throb in the back of his mind now surged forward, cold and sharp. For the first time, he started to truly believe. Not with his logical mind, but with a primal, animal part of him that recognized mortal danger. "I'm here now," he said, holding up his hands, palms forward. "Look, I'm me. I'm awake." Chloe's eyes narrowed, her suspicion a palpable force. "Is that so? Who were you on the phone with right before you decided to make this drive?" Liam's mind raced, the question catching him off guard. The fog of exhaustion made it hard to recall simple details. My friend, Mark. We were talking about the drive. He told me it was a stupid idea to do it all at once." "What's your mother's name?" she snapped, the questions coming like bullets. "Sarah," he answered immediately. "What was the name of the street you grew up on?" "Oak Street. 122 Oak Street. First pet's name, Buddy. He was a golden retriever. He got hit by a mail truck when I was 10, Liam said, the painful memory surfacing with surprising clarity. He looked at her, his own fear now mixed with a desperate plea to be believed. "I'm still me, I swear." Chloe held his gaze for a long, tense moment before she slowly, reluctantly, lowered the fork and placed it back on the counter. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, but the atmosphere in the diner was forever changed. He was no longer a stranded traveler. He was a contamination risk. A walking time bomb of exhaustion. The bell above the door tinkled again, and Sheriff Thompson filled the doorway, his face even more grim than before. He took in the scene, Liam looking pale and frantic, Chloe looking like a cornered animal, and his frown deepened. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. "He almost went under," Arthur said from the booth, his voice regaining its tremor. The boy nodded off. Just for a second. The sheriff's gaze hardened as he looked at Liam. It wasn't a look of anger, but of profound, weary disappointment. "Son, you have any idea the mess you could have caused? If you had turned, in here? This diner is the closest thing we have to a safe zone." I know I'm sorry, I'm trying, Liam pleaded, feeling like a child being scolded. Trying isn't good enough, the sheriff said, turning his attention to Chloe. It's the Millers. Their light is out. No answer on the radio check-in. A fresh wave of cold dread washed through the diner. Chloe's face went white. All of them. The house is dark, the sheriff confirmed. David, Susan, and little Maya. I've been watching the house for 20 minutes. No movement. We have to go check. He looked back at Liam, a difficult decision forming on his face. We can't leave him here. Not now. He's a risk. If he nods off again when we're gone. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The idea of one of the replacements being inside their only sanctuary was unthinkable. He's coming with us. Liam's stomach dropped. Coming with you? Where? To that house. That's right, the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You want to prove you're still with us? You'll help us. And trust me, nothing will keep you awake like seeing what happens when someone fails. A few minutes later, Liam found himself stepping out of the diner and into the chilling, silent night of Havenwood. The air was cold and bit at his exposed skin. Sheriff Thompson led the way, a heavy-duty flashlight in his hand, its beam cutting a sharp, lonely path through the oppressive darkness. Chloe walked beside Liam, carrying a tire iron that she gripped with white-knuckled intensity. Arthur remained behind, tasked with guarding the diner, a lone sentinel in a sea of encroaching dread. The walk was the most terrifying experience of Liam's life. The silence was absolute. The houses on either side of the street were like tombs, their windows dark, watchful eyes. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen movement. Liam's own breathing sounded deafeningly loud in the stillness. Stay off the lawns, the sheriff whispered, his voice sharp. Stay on the pavement. Keep your eyes moving. Don't stare at any one place for too long. Liam saw movement in his peripheral vision. Under a flickering streetlight down a side alley, a figure was standing. It was a woman in a nightgown, her head tilted at a slightly unnatural angle, her bare feet planted on the cold asphalt. She was perfectly still, simply watching them pass. The beam from the sheriff's flashlight didn't even make her flinch. Liam felt a deep, primal fear grip him. The woman wasn't waiting for anything. She was just there. An empty vessel in the dark. Don't look, Chloe hissed beside him, her voice a low vibration. Keep walking. He forced his eyes forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The Miller house was at the end of the block, a two-story home with a neat picket fence. As the sheriff had said, it was completely dark. A child's tricycle lay on its side in the middle of the front lawn, one wheel spinning slowly in the faint breeze. The sight was so mundane, yet so utterly horrifying in this context. They stopped at the gate. The sheriff played his flashlight beam across the front of the house. The windows were blank, black squares. The porch swing was still. Everything was as it should be, except for one crucial detail. The front door, the sheriff breathed. It's open. Just a crack. He unholstered his pistol, the click of the safety being disengaged echoing loud in the night. Chloe tightened her grip on the tire iron. Liam felt completely and utterly exposed, his body screaming with a fight-or-flight response that had nowhere to go. Chloe, you stay with the boy, the sheriff commanded in a low tone. Cover the back. Yell if you see anything. Anything at all. He looked at Liam. You. Don't make a sound. And whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, do not close your eyes. Do you understand me? Liam could only manage a numb, terrified nod. Sheriff Thompson moved with practiced silence up the walkway, his flashlight beam preceding him, his gun held at the ready. He reached the porch, nudged the door with his foot, and it swung inward with a faint, mournful creak, revealing a sliver of the pitch-black hallway within. He paused for a heartbeat, listening. The silence from inside the house was heavier, more profound, than the silence of the street outside. He took a deep breath, then slipped through the doorway, disappearing into the suffocating darkness of the Miller home. Liam and Chloe were left alone in the street, staring at the open doorway, which now looked like the gaping maw of some great sleeping beast. All they could do was wait, their ears straining against the silence for a sound, any sound, that would tell them what was waiting inside. The seconds after Sheriff Thompson disappeared into the Miller house stretched into an eternity. Liam stood frozen on the sidewalk, the cold seeping through the soles of his shoes, a stark contrast to the hot, panicked drumming of his own heart. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, ready to spring. The silence that poured from the open doorway was a living entity, a predator waiting in the dark. Beside him, Chloe stood just as still, her head cocked, listening with an intensity that made her seem more like a wild animal than a young woman. "What's he doing in there?" Liam whispered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Listening," Chloe whispered back without looking at him. "Seeing. He's looking for signs. Things that are out of place. A dish left in the sink that shouldn't be there. A picture frame that's slightly crooked. The little things. The copies, they don't notice the details. And if he finds them, then he gets out." Her answer was grim, final. Liam's exhaustion was a constant, physical pressure behind his eyes. It was a siren's call, promising the sweet relief of oblivion, a promise he now understood to be a death sentence. He pinched the skin on the back of his hand, hard, welcoming the small, sharp pain as a reminder to stay grounded, to stay awake. He scanned the street, the dark windows of the neighboring houses. He imagined faces behind every one of them, pale and empty, watching their little drama unfold. The thought made his skin crawl. Then, a sound. It was faint at first, so quiet he wasn't sure he'd heard it at all. A delicate, tinny melody drifting from the dark interior of the house. It was a music box. The tune was simple, childlike. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," but played slowly, slightly off-key. It was the most menacing sound Liam had ever heard. He and Chloe exchanged a wide-eyed look of pure terror. It wasn't just a sound, it was an invitation. A trap being sprung. "No," Chloe breathed, taking an involuntary step back. "They know he's there. They're playing with him." The music continued its slow, hypnotic little waltz, a cheerful dirge in the dead silent house. And then it was joined by another sound. A heavy, sickening thud from upstairs, followed by the clatter of something metallic hitting a wooden floor. The sheriff's flashlight. "Sheriff!" Chloe yelled, her voice cutting through the night. The only answer was the relentless, cheerful melody of the music box. A new sound followed, a dragging, scraping noise. Something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. "We have to go," Chloe said, grabbing Liam's arm, her survival instincts kicking in. "We run back to the diner right now." But Liam was rooted to the spot. He thought of the sheriff's weary face, the responsibility he carried for this whole broken town. The man had walked into that house to protect these people, and now he was in trouble. To run felt wrong. It felt cowardly. "We can't just leave him," Liam said, surprised by the resolve in his own voice. What will they do to him?" He knew the risks, Chloe argued, her voice tight with panic, but her feet weren't moving either. The choice was tearing her apart. Suddenly, a loud crash from a downstairs room, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. The music box stopped. The silence that rushed back in was 100 times worse than before. It was a loaded silence, full of imminent violence. That was it. The decision was made for them. With a shared look of grim determination, Chloe hefted the tire iron and Liam followed her as she ran up the walkway and onto the porch. They paused at the doorway, peering into the abyss of the house. The air that wafted out was stale and cold, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness, like old perfume. "Sheriff!" Chloe called again, her voice a strained whisper. Silence. Using her phone's small screen for a faint light, she stepped across the threshold. Liam was right behind her, his senses screaming, every nerve ending alight with adrenaline. They were in a small foyer that opened into a living room. Moonlight from a large window cast eerie, long shadows, revealing the shapes of furniture draped in darkness. A sofa, an armchair, a fallen lamp with a shattered base, the source of the crash. On the floor near the lamp lay the sheriff's heavy flashlight, its beam now dead. And next to it, the sheriff himself. He was sprawled on his back, a dark gash on his forehead, but his chest was rising and falling in shallow breaths. He was unconscious. As Chloe rushed to his side, Liam's eyes were drawn to the far side of the room. There, sitting on the sofa, were 3 figures. A man, a woman, and a small child between them. The Millers. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were just sitting perfectly upright, their hands folded neatly in their laps, their bodies silhouetted against the moonlight. They were watching. Liam felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room sink deep into his bones. This was it. This was what he had been warned about. The copies. Their stillness was the most unnatural thing he had ever witnessed. It was the stillness of a predator, perfectly patient, waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. "We have to get him out of here," Chloe whispered urgently, trying to drag the sheriff by his arms. He was a dead weight. "They're just sitting there," Liam breathed, unable to tear his eyes away from the silent family. "Why aren't they doing anything?" As if in answer to his question, the little girl on the sofa, Maya, slowly lifted a hand and pointed. Not at Chloe or the fallen sheriff, but directly at Liam. The man and woman, David and Susan, turned their heads in perfect, eerie unison. Their movements were smooth, fluid, and utterly silent. Two pairs of eyes, dark and depthless in the gloom, fixed on him. They didn't feel human. They felt like the eyes of insects, cold and analytical. Then, David Miller, the father, began to rise from the sofa. He didn't push himself up with his hands or grunt with effort. He simply unfolded, rising to his full height in one seamless, silent motion, as if being pulled upward by invisible strings. His face was a blank canvas, devoid of anger, devoid of any emotion at all. It was the absolute emptiness that was so terrifying. He took a step forward, then another. His feet made no sound on the hardwood floor. "Liam," Chloe choked out, her voice filled with a new, frantic terror. "Liam, get back." But Liam was paralyzed, pinned in place by the silent advance of the thing that wore David Miller's face. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The father thing kept coming, its empty eyes locked on him, its expressionless face a promise of a fate worse than death. It was the walking, breathing embodiment of the town's nightmare, and it was coming for him. For a horrifying, frozen moment, Liam's brain simply refused to function. Fight or flight were not options. There was only a paralyzing, all-consuming fear that turned his blood to ice and his limbs to lead. The thing wearing David Miller's face moved with a terrifying grace, its silent, methodical advance closing the distance between them. There was no malice in its eyes, no anger, just a placid, predatory emptiness. It was the face of a void come to claim him. Just as the figure raised its hands, not to strike, but to grab, a blur of motion exploded from Liam's right. "Get away from him!" Chloe screamed, her voice a raw, furious sound that shattered the room's oppressive silence. She swung the tire iron with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. The heavy steel bar connected with the side of the David thing's head with a sickening, wet crunch. It was a sound that would have made a normal man scream and collapse. But the replacement barely reacted. Its head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, but it didn't fall. It didn't even stumble. There was no cry of pain, no grunt of surprise. It simply stopped, its head now cocked at a grotesquely unnatural angle, its blank eyes still fixed on Liam. That moment of broken stillness was all it took to snap Liam from his trance. The raw violence of the impact, Chloe's desperate yell, it was a bucket of ice water to his soul. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor. "Liam, the sheriff." "Now!" Chloe yelled, brandishing the tire iron as she backed away from the damaged but still standing creature. Across the room, the other two replacements began to stir. Susan Miller rose from the sofa with the same eerie, silent fluidity as her husband. The little girl, Maya, slid off the couch and onto the floor, her movements unervingly quick and insect-like. She crawled on all fours, scuttling across the rug towards the fallen sheriff with a speed that was deeply wrong for a child her size. "No, you don't!" Chloe shouted, positioning herself between the crawling child thing and the sheriff's unconscious form. Adrenaline surged through Liam, a potent antidote to his paralysis. He scrambled over to the sheriff and grabbed him under the arms. "I've got him! Let's go!" he grunted, pulling with all his might. The sheriff was a dead weight, his body limp and heavy. Liam dug his heels in, dragging the man's body across the floor, his boots scuffing loudly on the wood. The David thing began to move again. It straightened its head with a soft, audible click of vertebrae, its eyes never leaving Liam. It ignored Chloe completely, its sole focus on the original target. It started its silent, gliding walk once more. Susan was right behind it, a perfect, silent echo. "The door, Liam, the door." Chloe urged, retreating backward, using the tire iron to keep the unervingly fast child thing at bay. Liam pulled and strained, his muscles burning, his lungs on fire. He dragged the sheriff through the foyer, past the overturned table, and finally, out of the gaping black maw of the front door. He stumbled out onto the porch, collapsing onto the cold wood as he pulled the sheriff's torso clear of the threshold. The icy night air was a shock to his system, but it felt like the sweetest, most life-giving breath he had ever taken. Chloe backed out onto the porch a second later, her face pale in the moonlight. She slammed the flimsy wooden door shut. There was no lock on the outside. It wouldn't hold them for long. "Help me," she panted, and together they dragged the sheriff down the porch steps and onto the frozen lawn, away from the house. They didn't stop to see if the door would open. They didn't look back. They just ran. Or rather, they half ran, half stumbled, dragging and carrying the dead weight of Sheriff Thompson between them. It was a clumsy, agonizing retreat. The sheriff's feet dragged on the pavement, the sound echoing unervingly in the dead quiet of the street. Liam's mind was a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. The crunch of the tire iron, the silent, relentless advance of the replacements, the spider-like scuttling of the child, it all played on a loop in his head. This was real. This was happening. There was no waking up from this nightmare, because the nightmare was reality, and sleep was the enemy. Every dark window they passed felt like a hostile eye. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like the silent footfalls of their pursuers. Liam risked a single glance over his shoulder. The porch of the Miller house was empty. The door remained shut, but the upstairs window was no longer dark. A small silhouette stood there, perfectly still, watching them go. By the time the warm yellow light of the diner came into view, Liam's arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. His lungs burned with every ragged gasp of air. They practically fell against the diner door. Arthur, his face etched with terror, had clearly been watching from the window. He wrenched the door open and helped them haul the sheriff inside. Chloe bolted the door behind them and flipped the heavy deadbolt, the sound of the tumblers falling into place a reassuringly solid series of clicks. For a moment, they all just stood there in the brightly lit diner, panting, sweating despite the cold, their chests heaving. They were safe. For now. What happened? What was in there? Arthur asked, his voice a panicked whisper. They got them, Chloe gasped, leaning against the counter for support. All of them. We have to, the sheriff. They carefully lowered Sheriff Thompson to the clean linoleum floor. Chloe knelt beside him, gently probing the gash on his forehead. It was bloody but didn't look incredibly deep. It was the impact that was the problem. A concussion, almost certainly. Liam finally allowed himself to collapse onto a stool, his body trembling uncontrollably from the adrenaline crash. He had seen it. He had faced it. The empty, soulless things that walked his world. The skepticism that had clung to him like a shroud was completely and irrevocably gone, burned away by the terror of the last 10 minutes. He was a believer now. We need to wake him up, Arthur said anxiously. We can't let him sleep it off. Not with a head injury. Not here. Chloe nodded, her expression grim. Get me the first aid kit from the back. And the smelling salts. As Arthur scurried off, Chloe looked at the unconscious man on the floor, her face a mixture of concern and a new, terrible suspicion. This is bad, Liam, she said quietly. He's the one who organizes the watchers, the supply runs. He holds everything together. She was right. Without the sheriff, the town's fragile defense against the night would crumble. But a more sinister thought began to creep into Liam's mind. The sheriff was unconscious. He was, for all intents and purposes, asleep. What if the rules were absolute? What if even a forced sleep, a coma from an injury, was enough to open the door? As if hearing his thoughts, the sheriff let out a low groan. His eyelids began to flutter. Chloe leaned in close, a flicker of hope on her face. Sheriff, can you hear me? It's Chloe. Sheriff Thompson's eyes slowly, painfully, cracked open. He blinked, his gaze unfocused as he stared up at the diner's ceiling. He groaned again, lifting a hand to his wounded head. Sheriff, Liam said, his voice trembling slightly. Are you okay? Do you know where you are? The sheriff's eyes swiveled, moving from Chloe's face to Liam's. The unfocused, dazed look began to clear, replaced by something else. A kind of stillness. A placid blankness. He stared at Liam for a long, silent moment. Then, his lips parted, and he spoke, his voice a strange, flat monotone that was nothing like his usual weary rasp. The boy, he said, his eyes empty. You brought the boy. The sheriff's words fell into the diner's stunned silence like stones into a deep, dark well. The boy. You brought the boy. It wasn't the words themselves, but the delivery. The voice was a hollow echo of the man they knew, a flat, toneless drone devoid of pain, confusion, or any human emotion. His eyes, now fully open, were the worst part. They were clear and focused, but they were looking at them, not seeing them. It was the same placid, empty gaze Liam had seen in the Miller house. Chloe, who had been leaning over the sheriff with cautious hope, recoiled as if she'd been struck. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Arthur, who had just returned from the back room with a dusty first aid kit, froze in his tracks, the kit slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering to the floor. Sheriff. Chloe tested, her voice a fragile whisper. What was my mother's secret ingredient in her apple pie? You always used to joke about it. The thing wearing the sheriff's uniform continued to stare, its expression unchanging. A slow, faint, and utterly mirthless smile touched its lips. Pie is not important, it said in that same flat monotone. The quiet is important. That was it. That was the confirmation. The real Sheriff Thompson loved Chloe's mother's pie and would have known the answer instantly, a dash of cinnamon. This thing, this copy, didn't know. It didn't care. It was like asking a statue for its opinion. With a speed that belied his head injury, the sheriff thing began to sit up. Its movements were economical and smooth, lacking any of the grogginess or pain a man in his condition should have had. It was getting up to do something. To open the door. To let the quiet night in. No, Chloe breathed, her fear instantly hardening into steely resolve. She grabbed the tire iron she had dropped by the door. Arthur, the back room. Block the door from the outside. Liam, get ready. The sheriff thing was on its feet now, standing tall. It ignored Chloe and the weapon in her hand. It ignored Arthur scrambling away in terror. Its empty eyes were fixed solely on the bolted front door, its objective clear. It took a step. I said no. Chloe yelled, and she lunged, swinging the heavy tire iron not at its head, but at its legs, aiming for the knee. The blow landed with a solid, meaty thud. A human would have screamed, his leg buckling. The sheriff thing barely flinched. It paused, its head slowly turning to look down at Chloe as if she were a minor, buzzing annoyance. Then it continued its walk toward the door. Liam's mind, which had been reeling from the shock, finally kicked into gear. This was happening. The monster wasn't outside anymore. It was inside with them. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy-bottomed glass coffee pot full of the day's cold dregs, and he charged. He swung it with all his might against the sheriff thing's back. The glass exploded on impact, sending cold coffee in shards everywhere. The creature staggered forward a step, more from the momentum than the pain. It turned its head slowly, its entire 180-degree turn unervingly smooth, and fixed its blank gaze on Liam. The faint, unsettling smile remained. This was their leader, their protector. And now they were in a desperate, clumsy fight for their lives against his stolen body in the one place they thought was safe. The creature raised its hands, reaching for Liam. But Chloe was there again, swinging the tire iron at its arm, forcing it to recoil. The pantry, she shouted, seeing Arthur frantically waving from a door behind the counter. Push him in there. It was a chaotic, desperate struggle. Liam grabbed a chair and rammed it into the creature's chest, trying to force it backward. It was shockingly strong, its resistance like pushing against a solid wall. Chloe used the tire iron as a prod, jabbing and striking, forcing it to turn, to retreat step by agonizing step. It didn't fight back in a conventional way. It didn't throw punches or yell. It just moved with a relentless, single-minded purpose, trying to get past them, its hands periodically reaching out with a slow, deliberate motion. They shoved and pushed, a frantic, stumbling trio, and finally managed to force the creature through the doorway into the dark, narrow pantry. Chloe slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and Liam threw his entire body weight against it. The bolt! Arthur yelled from the other side. It only locks from in here. With shaking, clumsy fingers, Chloe slid the thick, heavy iron bolt across its housing. The solid thunk echoed in the now quiet diner. They were safe. The immediate threat was contained. For a moment, the three of them just leaned against the door, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling. From inside the pantry, there was no sound. No banging, no yelling. Just silence. The silence was almost worse. Liam slid down the door to the floor, his head in his hands, the horror of it all crashing down on him. He's gone, he whispered. He's really gone. They're all gone, kid, Chloe said, her voice heavy with a grief she had clearly carried for a long time. She slid down to sit on the floor beside him. Arthur slumped onto a nearby stool, looking 100 years old. The sanctuary had been violated. Their leader was now a monster locked in their storeroom. The rules they thought they understood had changed. Unconsciousness was now as dangerous as sleep. They were leaderless, hopeless, and running on fumes. What do we do now? Arthur asked the question that hung in the air, his voice barely a croak. The sun is still hours away. The other watchers, they'll be expecting to hear from the sheriff on the radio. Chloe ran a hand through her greasy hair. We wait. We just have to make it to sunrise. That's all we can do. But the night wasn't finished with them. As she spoke, a soft, rhythmic sound started. Tap, tap, tap. It was quiet, gentle, almost polite. It wasn't coming from the pantry door. It was coming from the large plate glass window at the front of the diner. Slowly, cautiously, Liam got to his feet. He crept towards the window, his heart pounding in his throat. Chloe was right behind him, the tire iron held at the ready. He peered through the gap in the blinds. The street was no longer empty. Standing under the buzzing orange glow of the streetlight, right across from the diner, was the Miller family. David stood with his head still at that slightly off angle, Susan beside him, their daughter Maya holding her mother's hand. They were not alone. Another half-dozen figures were emerging from the shadows of the neighboring houses and alleyways. The woman in the nightgown from earlier was there. An elderly man in his pajamas. A teenage boy. All of them standing in perfect, unnerving silence. All of them staring directly at the diner. And then, one of them, the father, David Miller, slowly lifted his hand and placed his palm flat against an invisible wall in the air, right where the diner's window would be. From inside, it sounded like a soft tap. Tap, tap, tap. They weren't trying to break in. Not yet. They were just watching. Waiting. The commotion at the Miller house, the fight in the diner, it had been a beacon, calling them out of the shadows. Liam, Chloe, and Arthur looked at each other, the same horrifying realization dawning on all of them. Their sanctuary had just become a cage, and all the monsters were gathering outside to watch. The sight of the silent gathering crowd outside the diner window was a new kind of terror. The fight in the Miller house had been a frantic, desperate struggle for survival against a tangible threat. This was different. This was psychological warfare. The replacements weren't attacking. They were just bearing witness. Their stillness was an accusation, their silent vigil a promise of what was to come. The diner, which minutes ago had felt like a fortress, now felt like a glass box in a zoo of monsters. Liam's heart, which had just begun to slow its frantic rhythm, kicked back into a panicked gallop. He could see them all so clearly under the sterile orange streetlights. The Millers were at the forefront, their faces impassive. The woman in the nightgown stood beside them, her bare feet seemingly immune to the cold pavement. Every single one of them was staring, their heads tilted in a way that suggested not curiosity, but a kind of cold, detached analysis, like a scientist observing specimens in a jar. The soft, rhythmic tapping from the David Miller thing continued, a patient, unnerving drumbeat that echoed the pounding in Liam's own head. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of inevitability. "They've never done this before," Arthur stammered, his face pale and slack with shock. He clutched the counter to keep himself upright. "They've always kept to themselves, sticking to the shadows. I've never seen so many out in the open. The fight at the Millers, the commotion in here. We rang the dinner bell," Chloe said, her voice a low, grim whisper. She pulled Liam away from the window. "Get back. Both of you. Away from the glass." She began moving with a frantic, purposeful energy, the shock giving way to her ingrained survival instincts. "Arthur, get the sacks of flour and sugar from the pantry entryway. We stacked them against the door. Liam, help me with these tables. We're covering the windows." The idea of the pantry door made Liam's stomach clench. The sheriff thing was in there. Silent. For now. "Is that a good idea? Going near that door?" "We don't have a choice," she shot back, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "We have a problem in that room, but we have a dozen problems out on the street. We deal with the bigger threat first." Liam didn't argue. Having a task, something physical to focus on, was a relief. It was better than standing still and letting the terror consume him. He and Chloe began dragging the heavy wooden tables, appending them and shoving them against the large front windows, creating a crude barricade. It wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it blocked the view. It stopped the watching. As they worked, Arthur hesitated, his face a mask of crumbling despair. "What's the point, Chloe? Look at them. We lost the sheriff. It's over. We're just delaying the inevitable." "No one's giving up, Arthur," Chloe snapped, not unkindly, but with the firm authority of a field commander. "We've survived this long. We can survive one more night. Now move." The sacks. Arthur, chastened, shuffled off to the pantry entrance to begin the grueling work of moving the heavy supplies. As Liam helped Chloe hoist the last table into place, he had to ask, "Why are they doing this? Just standing there? If they wanted to get in, they'd just break the glass, wouldn't they?" "They're not like us," Chloe panted, shoving the table into its final position. "They don't seem to think in straight lines. Sometimes they're smart, coordinated. Other times, they're like animals, just following a basic instinct. But they're always patient. They know they have the one thing we don't. Time," Liam finished for her, the realization sinking in like a stone. "They can wait forever. We can't. Eventually, we'll get tired. Eventually, we have to fall asleep." His own words sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. The exhaustion was still there, a monstrous weight on his shoulders, temporarily held at bay by adrenaline, but waiting its turn. How long did they have? Hours. Hours of this relentless pressure, this constant terror, with sleep, their own biological imperative, as the ultimate enemy. Just as they finished barricading the windows, a new sound cut through the air. A sharp crackle of static, followed by a voice from the radio set behind the counter. "Sheriff Thompson, this is Watcher 2, do you copy?" The voice was tinny, distorted, and laced with anxiety. "We're seeing them, Sheriff. They're on the move. It looks like they're all heading downtown. Towards you. What is your status? Over." The three of them froze. The radio, their only link to the rest of the town's survivors, was now a source of imminent danger. "Don't answer it," Arthur whispered frantically. "If they know we're here, they'll come. They'll walk right into it. If we don't answer, they might come anyway, thinking something's wrong," Liam countered. "They'll be walking into the same trap." "He's right," Chloe said, her eyes fixed on the radio as if it were a coiled snake. She walked over and picked up the handset, her thumb hovering over the transmit button. The fate of the other watchers, maybe the entire surviving population of Havenwood, rested on what she said next. "Watcher 2, this is Central," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "Listen to me very carefully. The sheriff is unavailable. Central is compromised. I repeat, Central is compromised." "Compromised?" The voice on the other end crackled back, confused. "What do you mean? Should we?" "Negative," Chloe cut him off, her voice dropping to an urgent, commanding tone. "Maintain your position. Do not, under any circumstances, approach the diner. Lockdown. Barricade. Wait for sunrise. Do you copy?" There was a pause, a moment of static-filled silence as the other man processed the terrifying implications of her words. "Copy that, Central," he finally replied, his voice now tight with fear. "God help you. Watcher 2, out." Chloe replaced the handset, her hand trembling slightly. She had just saved them, but in doing so, she had officially declared the diner a lost cause, an island of the damned. They were completely and utterly on their own. And then, as if on cue, the psychological warfare ended. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the diner, making them all jump. It was the sound of fracturing glass. It was followed by a heavier, crunching thud. Liam and Chloe rushed to a gap in their table barricade and peered out. The silent vigil was over. The David Miller thing stood directly in front of the diner, a thick piece of broken pipe in his hand. A large, spider-webbing crack now marred the plate glass window. He drew his arm back again, his movements calm and methodical. The other replacements hadn't moved, but their heads were now all tilted in the same direction, their blank eyes focused on the newly formed crack in the glass. The tapping had stopped. The assault was beginning. The sharp, spider-webbing crack that blossomed across the diner's main window was the starting pistol for hell. The sound shattered the last vestiges of their fragile calm. The time for waiting, for psychological warfare, was over. The siege had turned violent. "They're coming in!" Arthur shrieked, stumbling backward from the counter, his face a mess of wrinkled panic. The thing wearing David Miller's face drew back the pipe and swung again. This time, the glass didn't just crack, it exploded inward in a shower of glittering, deadly shards. The heavy tables Liam and Chloe had shoved against the windows shuddered, absorbing the brunt of the glass storm, but the way in was now clear. The night air, cold and hostile, flooded the diner. Through the gaping hole, Liam could see them. Hands, pale, grasping, and unnaturally strong, began to push against the tables. There was no shouting, no war cries, just a silent, coordinated, and utterly relentless pressure. The legs of the tables groaned, scraping against the linoleum floor as the sheer weight of the crowd outside began to force them backward. "Push!" Chloe yelled, throwing her entire body against the main table. "Don't let them get a foothold." Liam needed no encouragement. He slammed his shoulder next to hers, his sneakers slipping on the slick floor as he dug in, adding his weight to hers. The pressure from the other side was immense, a solid, unyielding force. Through the gaps between the tables, he could see faces, blank, emotionless, their eyes fixed on the warm, lighted interior of the diner. They weren't angry. They were just determined. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. "The back door!" Chloe grunted, her voice strained with effort. "Arthur, go! Make sure it's secure. Now!" Spurred into action, Arthur scrambled toward the rear of the diner, disappearing into the kitchen. Liam and Chloe were left alone to hold the front line. The table shifted another inch. A pale arm snaked through a gap, its fingers blindly grasping, searching. Liam flinched back, his heart in his throat. "We can't hold this for long," he gasped, the muscles in his legs and back screaming in protest. We don't have to hold it for long, Chloe said through clenched teeth. We just have to hold it until sunrise. Sunrise felt like a lifetime away, an impossible dream. The pressure on the tables intensified. More hands appeared, pushing, clawing, their collective force building like a rising tide. Suddenly, Arthur's panicked voice echoed from the kitchen. Chloe, in here. The breaker box. They're at the breaker box. Chloe let out a string of curses. If the lights go out, we're dead, she snarled, a new, desperate edge to her voice. She looked at Liam, her eyes wild in the flickering diner light. The decision was instantaneous. You have to go. Help him. I'll hold them. You can't hold this alone. Liam protested. I have to. Now go, she screamed, and with a surge of adrenaline, she somehow managed to shove the table forward half an inch, buying a precious second. Liam didn't hesitate any longer. He turned and sprinted for the kitchen. He burst through the swinging doors to see Arthur cowering by the sinks, pointing a trembling finger at the diner's small, greasy back window. Outside, a figure stood with its back to them. It was the teenage boy he had seen in the street, and he was methodically using a crowbar to pry open the heavy metal door of the building's main circuit breaker. He's going to cut the power, Arthur whimpered. Liam's mind raced. He couldn't go outside, he'd be swarmed. He had to do something from in here. His eyes darted around the kitchen, a chaotic landscape of stainless steel and cooking equipment. He saw the industrial coffee machine, a large pot of water still sitting on its heating element from hours before. A light was on beneath it. It was hot. Get down, Liam ordered Arthur, and he grabbed the pot of scalding water. He moved to the small, grimy window, unlatched it with shaking hands, and slid it open just a crack. The teenage replacement outside didn't even notice, so intent was it on its task. The metal door of the breaker box groaned, about to give way. With a deep breath, Liam shoved the window fully open and hurled the entire contents of the pot at the figure. The scalding water hit the creature square in the back. A cloud of steam instantly billowed into the cold night air. The effect was immediate, but not human. There was no scream of agony. Instead, the replacement's body went rigid, a violent, full-body spasm that was purely mechanical. It dropped the crowbar with a clatter, its arms twitching, its back arching as its stolen nervous system overloaded from the sudden, extreme stimulus. It took a few stiff, jerky steps away from the wall before collapsing onto the asphalt, its limbs still twitching erratically. Liam slammed the window shut and locked it, his chest heaving. He had done it. He had stopped one of them. A small, cold part of his brain registered that he had just grievously injured what looked like a teenage boy, but the larger, survival-focused part knew he had just fought off a monster. You did it, Arthur breathed, a look of awe on his face. You saved us. A surge of triumphant adrenaline coursed through Liam. For the first time all night, he felt a sliver of hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could survive. And that's when they heard it. It wasn't a noise from the front of the diner, where the sounds of Chloe's desperate struggle still raged. It wasn't from the street outside. It came from behind them. From the pantry. Crack. It was the sharp, ugly sound of splintering wood. Loud, violent, and purposeful. Liam and Arthur spun around to face the pantry door. A thin, horizontal fracture had appeared across the middle of the heavy wood, right where the bolt was mounted on the other side. In the chaos of the main assault, they had forgotten. They hadn't just barricaded the pantry door with supplies. Arthur had only gone to the entryway. The door itself was held by nothing but a single, sturdy deadbolt. Crack. Thud. Another blow landed from the inside. The crack in the door widened, sawdust trickling from the new fissure. The thing that had been Sheriff Thompson was awake. It was angry, and it was done waiting. Liam looked from the splintering pantry door to the swinging doors leading back to the main diner. He could hear Chloe yelling, the barricade groaning. They had stopped the threat at the back. They had held the line at the front. But they had just realized the attack was coming from inside the house all along. The triumphant surge of adrenaline Liam felt was terrifyingly short-lived. The victory at the back window evaporated in an instant, replaced by a new, more immediate, and far more intimate horror. The sharp, violent crack of splintering wood from the pantry door was the sound of their fatal mistake. In focusing on the enemy at their gates, they had forgotten the one they had willingly locked inside their own walls. Arthur let out a choked, gurgling cry, his face losing what little color it had left. The bolt, he gasped. We didn't stack anything against the door itself. Only the entryway. Another heavy, sickening thud echoed from within the pantry. The fracture in the door widened into a gaping wound, the wood around the deadbolt's housing groaning in protest. This was not the mindless banging of a trapped animal. It was a focused, intelligent assault, aimed at the lock, at the door's single point of failure. "The prep table! Help me!" Liam yelled, his mind snapping into a desperate, problem-solving mode. He grabbed the edge of a heavy, stainless steel table in the center of the kitchen. It was laden with pots and pans that clattered loudly as he heaved it an inch off the floor. "We have to barricade it!" The table weighed a ton. Arthur, spurred by a fresh wave of terror, grabbed the other side, and together they began a clumsy, frantic effort to drag it across the floor. It was a race against the rhythmic, destructive blows from the pantry. The metal legs of the table screeched in protest against the tiled floor, a horrible, grating sound that set Liam's teeth on edge. Thud. Crack. The sound from the pantry was getting louder, the impacts more powerful. The sheriff thing was breaking through. From the front of the diner, Chloe's voice, strained and desperate, cut through the noise. "Liam, what was that? What's happening back there? I can't hold this much longer." He couldn't answer. He couldn't spare the breath. He and Arthur gave a final, desperate heave, the table scraping to a halt just a foot from the pantry door. It wasn't enough. They needed it flush against the wood. They never got the chance. With a final, explosive crash, the lock mechanism shattered completely. The pantry door flew inward, torn from its splintered frame, and slammed against the wall. Standing in the darkened doorway, silhouetted by the single bare bulb of the pantry, was the thing that had once been Sheriff Thompson. He was unervingly calm. His uniform was torn and covered in sawdust, and he held a heavy, splintered piece of door jamb in one hand like a primitive club. But his face was placid, his eyes empty pools of darkness. He took in the scene, the kitchen in disarray, Arthur whimpering in a corner, Liam standing frozen between the creature and the old man. The faint, unsettling smile was back on his lips. The sheriff thing took a silent step forward, its focus entirely on Liam. It ignored Arthur completely. Its movements were fluid, lacking any of the stiffness Liam had seen in the replacement he'd fought outside. This one was different. It was fresher, stronger. "Get back, Arthur," Liam said, his voice a reedy whisper he barely recognized as his own. He began to back away, his eyes darting around for a weapon, anything better than his bare hands. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from a stovetop, its weight a small, cold comfort in his trembling grasp. The creature kept advancing, its silent, gliding walk eating up the distance between them in the cramped kitchen. Liam knew he couldn't fight it. The creature felt no pain. It had one goal. He was outmatched, and he knew it. His mind screamed at him to think, to find another way. The boiling water had worked because it was a sensory overload. What else was there? Sound. His eyes flickered past the creature's shoulder to the wall by the swinging doors. He saw it. A small, red metal box with a white handle. A fire alarm pull station. It was an insane, desperate gamble. The noise would be deafening, agonizing for them as well as the creature. It would signal their exact position to every replacement in the street. It might cause a panic that would allow the mob outside to finally break through Chloe's barricade. It was the worst possible idea, and it was the only one he had. The sheriff thing was only a few feet away now. It raised the splintered club, its movements still eerily unhurried, as if the outcome was a foregone conclusion. It was toying with him. In that split second, Liam made his choice. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a hero. He was a tired, terrified college kid who had stumbled into a nightmare. But he was also the person who had saved the lights, and he was the only thing standing between this monster and a terrified old man. He had to do something. Feinting left, he dodged the creature's first slow, deliberate swing. The wooden club whistled through the air where his head had been a second before and smashed into a rack of stainless steel bowls, sending them clattering to the floor. That was the opening he needed. Instead of trying to fight back, he lunged. He sprinted past the creature, his shoulder bumping its solid, unyielding form, and threw himself at the wall. His fingers closed around the cool metal handle of the fire alarm. The sheriff thing was already turning, its movements unnaturally fast now, its placid expression for the first time showing a flicker of something else. A kind of cold, predatory focus. It was done playing. With the last of his strength, Liam pulled the handle down. The world went silent for a single, impossibly long heartbeat. The moment stretched, filled with the creature's advancing form, Chloe's distant yelling, and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. The handle was down. The circuit was complete. And in that final terrifying instant before the consequences of his actions crashed down upon them all, he had only one thought: what have I done? The pull handle clicked into its final position, and for a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath. Then, Liam's world exploded into noise and light. An ear-splitting, industrial-grade shriek erupted from a horn on the ceiling, a solid wall of sound so powerful it felt like a physical blow. It was a dentist's drill in his skull, a sheet of metal being torn in half next to his ear. Simultaneously, a red strobe light mounted next to the horn began to flash, plunging the kitchen into a frantic, pulsating hellscape of crimson and shadow. One moment the scene was lit in stark, bloody red, the next it was plunged into near-total darkness. Liam was thrown back by the sheer sensory assault, his hands flying to his ears, a useless gesture against a noise that seemed to bypass them entirely and bore directly into his brain. Across the room, Arthur collapsed to the floor, curling into a fetal position, his face a rictus of agony. But the effect on the sheriff thing was immediate and profound. The creature, which had been lunging for Liam, froze mid-stride. Its placid mask of emptiness shattered. Its head snapped back, its jaw going slack. Its body began to twitch, a series of violent, spastic jerks, as if every one of its stolen muscles was firing at once. The splintered club fell from its nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. It was not reacting with pain, it was reacting with system failure. The overwhelming, chaotic sensory input was something its simple, predatory programming could not process. It was a living machine caught in a logic loop, glitching and shuddering in the pulsating red light. Liam's gamble had worked. It was an agonizing, double-edged victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He staggered to his feet, the shrieking alarm a constant torment. He had to act now, while the creature was incapacitated. He looked over at Arthur, who was still balled up on the floor. "We have to pantry, now." Liam screamed, his own voice sounding thin and distant against the klaxon. Just then, Chloe burst through the swinging doors from the main diner, her face pale, the tire iron held in a white-knuckled grip. "Liam, what in God's name did you do?" she yelled, flinching as the strobe light flashed across her face. "It worked," Liam yelled back, pointing a shaking finger at the twitching sheriff thing. "It's the noise. It stuns them. The pushing at the front, did it stop?" Chloe's eyes widened in dawning realization. "Yes," she said, her voice full of disbelief. "They just stopped. They're stumbling around out there like they're drunk." She looked from the creature to the pantry. The table. Now, a new, shared purpose galvanized them. The noise was unbearable, but it had bought them a chance. Together, the three of them, even Arthur, who managed to crawl to his feet, shoved the heavy stainless steel prep table. It was a frantic, chaotic effort set to a soundtrack from hell. They used the table like a battering ram, slamming it into the disoriented sheriff thing. The creature offered little resistance, its movements spastic and uncoordinated. It stumbled backward, step by jerky step, until they had forced it back across the threshold and into the dark pantry. Without hesitation, Liam and Chloe shoved the heavy table hard against the doorway, wedging it firmly between the door jambs. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold. They fell back, gasping for breath in the shrieking, flashing chaos. The immediate threat was contained, again. But now they had a new problem. The alarm. It was an unbearable torture, and they had no idea if the replacement's disorientation was permanent. They couldn't live like this for the next few hours. They had to turn it off. "The panel!" Chloe shouted over the din, pointing toward a small, closed door at the back of the kitchen marked "Office." "It has to be in there." "I'll do it," Liam volunteered. It was his mess to clean up. He stumbled toward the office door, his vision swimming, his head pounding in rhythm with the strobe. Every flash of red light felt like a punch to the eyeballs. He fumbled with the knob, his fingers feeling clumsy and numb, and pushed the door open. The office was small, barely a closet, filled with a beat-up metal desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet. The alarm was slightly muffled in here, but still agonizingly loud. On the wall, just as Chloe had predicted, was the alarm system's control panel, a gray metal box with a small keyhole. The key was dangling from the lock. As Liam reached for the key, his eyes fell upon the cluttered surface of the desk. It was covered in invoices, old newspapers, and a collection of framed photographs. A man and a woman, presumably the diner's owners, smiled out from most of them. And in several, a much younger Chloe stood with them, her smile bright and genuine, a ghost of a girl who hadn't yet seen the world end. He was about to turn the key when he froze. He picked up one of the photos. It was a group picture, taken at what looked like a town picnic. The sun was bright, people were laughing. It looked old, the colors slightly faded. 10, maybe 15 years old. Long before the event, as Arthur had called it. Chloe was a teenager in the photo, standing with her arm around the smiling woman, her mother. But it wasn't them that held his attention. It was the background. Standing near a cluster of trees at the edge of the picnic was a man. A man who wasn't part of any group, who wasn't smiling. He was just watching. Liam's blood ran cold. He leaned closer, his eyes straining in the pulsating red light. He could just make it out. The man's eyes. They were placid, depthless, utterly and completely blank. The klaxon shrieked. The red light flashed, illuminating the photograph in a bloody, rhythmic pulse. Liam stared at the image of the smiling townsfolk, completely oblivious to the silent, empty-eyed figure that had been standing among them, watching them all those years ago. The alarm was no longer the loudest thing in the room. It was drowned out by the sudden roaring silence of a dozen horrifying questions that bloomed in Liam's mind. This hadn't started 3 years ago. It had been here all along. Hiding. Waiting. It had been in their photographs, at their picnics, walking their streets. And no one had ever noticed. The shrieking of the alarm had been a physical torment, but the silence that crashed down in its wake was somehow worse. It was a heavy, ringing void, filled only by the frantic thumping of Liam's own heart and the high-pitched whine of tinnitus in his ears. The pulsating red light was gone, replaced by the diner's normal, steady, fluorescent hum, which now seemed unnervingly placid. Liam stood frozen in the small office, the framed photograph clutched in his hand. The image felt impossibly heavy, freighted with a truth so monstrous his mind struggled to accept it. The man in the background. The blank, dead eyes. This wasn't a recent plague. It was a deep, old rot that had been festering at the heart of this town for years, maybe decades. Liam, you okay in there? You got it. Chloe's voice called from the kitchen, sounding strained and exhausted. He couldn't form a reply. He just stared at the smiling faces in the picture, a portrait of a town that had been living on the edge of a precipice, completely unaware of the abyss yawning beneath it. A moment later, Chloe appeared in the doorway, her face grimy, her knuckles bruised. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Her eyes fell to the photograph in his hand. What is that? Wordlessly, he handed it to her. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. This is just one of Mr. Henderson's old picnic photos. That's me, God, look at my hair. Her voice trailed off as her eyes found what he had seen. She squinted, bringing the photo closer. Her breath hitched. No, who is that? Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. I think that was Mr. Withers, she said, her own voice unsteady. He lived in that old cabin up on the ridge, kept to himself. The town kids used to dare each other to go near his property. He just vanished one winter. Everyone assumed he'd just packed up and left, or maybe wandered off into the woods. She looked up from the photo, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. But those eyes, Liam. I've never seen them in an old photo before. It's the same. It's the exact same emptiness. Arthur shuffled into the doorway behind her, drawn by the silence. What is it? What's going on? Chloe handed him the picture. The old man stared at it, his face crumbling as the implication sank in. Withers, he rasped. I remember him. He was always off, quiet. But I never would have thought, not back then. He looked up, his eyes filled with a despair so profound it was terrifying to behold. It's been here all along, he whispered. This isn't an invasion. It's a harvest. And we've been the crops the whole time. The weight of that revelation settled over them, suffocating and absolute. Everything they thought they knew about their enemy was wrong. This wasn't a sudden, monstrous transformation. It was a silent, patient replacement that had been happening right under their noses. Who else? Who else over the years had just moved away without saying goodbye? Who else had become a recluse, a town eccentric? Their memories, their entire shared history, was now a potential crime scene. The paranoia they felt for the night now stretched backward, poisoning the past itself. So the rule, Liam said, thinking out loud, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Don't fall asleep. That's not what lets them in. That's just what lets them take you quickly. They got sloppy, Chloe murmured, her eyes distant. Or hungry. 3 years ago, something changed. They stopped being careful. They started taking people en masse. But they were always here. Hiding. Watching. The thought was paralyzing. They weren't fighting a mindless horde. They were fighting an ancient, intelligent, and terrifyingly patient predator that had been culling their herd for generations. Their strategy of just surviving until sunrise felt like a child's game, a naive and hopeless ritual in the face of such an enemy. Liam felt a wave of dizziness, the combined weight of exhaustion, terror, and this new awful truth threatening to overwhelm him. He leaned against the desk, his body screaming for rest, for an escape that he knew would be fatal. He was so tired. It would be so easy to just close his eyes. A sudden sharp metallic scrape from the front of the diner cut through his exhaustion-fueled haze like a bolt of lightning. All three of them froze, their heads snapping toward the main dining area. The silence outside had been a relief, but now it was deeply ominous. What was that? Arthur whispered. Chloe was already moving, her survivor's instincts taking over once more. She crept silently out of the kitchen and into the main room, gesturing for them to stay back. She flattened herself against the wall next to the barricaded windows and peered through a small gap between two of the tables. Liam followed, his heart pounding. He watched Chloe's face. He saw her expression shift from tense caution to stark disbelief, then to pure, cold fear. She backed away from the window slowly, her movements stiff. "They've recovered," she said, her voice low and strained. The alarm, it did more than just stun them. It's like it forced them to reboot. To think. "What are you talking about?" Liam demanded, moving to the gap to see for himself. The scene outside had changed completely. The replacements were no longer a disorganized, twitching mob. They were a team. The teenage boy he had doused with water was back on his feet, seemingly unharmed, his focus absolute. He was holding the crowbar he'd dropped earlier. He wasn't wildly smashing it against the glass. He was using it with calm, terrifying precision, prying at the aluminum frame of the shattered window. The David Miller thing stood beside him, pointing at the joints in the frame, directing the work. The others were formed up behind them in a silent, organized line, as if waiting for orders. One of them was holding the heavy pipe, ready to strike on command. They had stopped being a mindless force of nature. They had become an army, and they were now systematically and intelligently dismantling the diner's defenses. The sight of the replacements working in silent, coordinated unison was a more profound horror than any mindless violence. The mindless mob had been a force of nature, something to be weathered. This was different. This was an execution. Liam watched, mesmerized with terror, as the teenage thing wedged the crowbar into a corner of the window frame and expertly applied pressure. The aluminum groaned and bent. The David Miller thing pointed to a new spot, a silent field commander directing his soulless troops. This was an enemy that learned. An enemy that adapted. The fire alarm had been a painful stimulus, and their response was not to flee, but to evolve. "They'll have the whole frame torn out in 5 minutes, Chloe said, her voice dangerously calm. It was the calmness of someone who has looked over the edge of a cliff and is calculating the odds of the fall. "The tables won't hold them after that. We can't stay here. But where do we go?" Arthur cried, his voice cracking. "The street is full of them. The diner is the only safe place in town." "It's not safe anymore," Chloe stated, the finality in her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's a tomb, and the door is about to be kicked in. We have to run." "Run where?" Liam asked, his mind struggling to keep up. The idea of leaving the relative safety of these four walls for the monster-filled streets was insane. "The old cannery," Chloe said, her eyes already distant, formulating a plan. "It's on the edge of town, by the river. It's been abandoned for 20 years. Brick walls, steel doors, and only a few windows, all of them reinforced with iron bars. If we can get there, we can hold up for a lot longer than we can hear." It was a desperate plan, a mad dash across a town crawling with intelligent predators. It was also their only option. "They're all at the front," Liam reasoned, the adrenaline of a new plan beginning to cut through his fear. "They're focused on the window. If we can create a diversion, something big, we might be able to slip out the back." "A diversion," Chloe repeated, a grim, dangerous glint in her eye. She looked around the diner, the place she had worked for years, the last bastion of her old life. "I've got an idea." She strode into the kitchen, her movements now filled with a terrifying purpose. "Liam, find me every bottle of cooking oil you can. Arthur, in the office, there's a blue backpack. It's our emergency go bag. Get it. Fill any empty bottles you can find with water from the tap. We're going to need it." Liam didn't question her. He scrambled through the kitchen supply shelves, grabbing large plastic jugs of vegetable oil and canola oil. He could hear the methodical thump and creak from the front of the diner as the replacements continued their work. It was a countdown clock. Arthur returned a minute later with a stuffed backpack, his face pale but his hands surprisingly steady. Having a task, a role to play in their own survival, seemed to have focused him. Chloe took the jugs of oil from Liam and, without a word, began pouring them all over the kitchen's large, flat-top grill. She soaked the countertops, the floor, anything that would burn. The air grew thick with the greasy, cloying smell. She was turning their sanctuary into a funeral pyre. "The gas," she said to Liam, pointing to the main valve for the stove. "When I give the word, you turn that on. All the way. Then you light this." She handed him a book of matches from a drawer. The finality of it all hit Liam like a physical blow. They were burning their boats. There would be no coming back from this. Their path to the back door took them past the barricaded pantry. A profound silence emanated from the door, which was now wedged shut with a heavy steel table. The sheriff thing was in there, quiet and contained. The thought of leaving it to be consumed by the fire was a grim one, but there was no other choice. It was a monster, and it was part of the tomb they were about to seal. Chloe crept to the back door and peered through the small, grimy window, the same one Liam had used to attack the teenage replacement. The alley outside was dark and, for the moment, empty. The sounds of the assault were all coming from the front. "Okay," Chloe whispered, her back pressed against the door. "This is it. Once we're out, we don't stop for anything. We run straight for the river, then follow it down to the cannery. No matter what you see or hear, you do not stop. Do you understand?" Liam and Arthur both gave her a mute, terrified nod. "Liam," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "Now." Liam's hands were shaking so badly he could barely strike a match. The first one broke. The second one fizzled out. He took a deep breath, the smell of oil filling his lungs, and struck the third. It flared to life. He turned the gas valve. A low hiss filled the kitchen. Then, he tossed the lit match onto the grease-soaked grill. The world erupted in a silent, brilliant whoosh. A wall of orange and yellow flame roared up from the grill, hitting the ceiling and spreading with terrifying speed. The heat was instantaneous and immense, forcing them all to recoil. Black smoke began to billow, thick and choking. The diversion had begun. "Go!" Chloe yelled, and she unbolted the back door, pulling it open just enough for them to slip through. Arthur went first, scrambling out into the cold night air. Liam was right behind him. He took one last look back at the inferno consuming the kitchen, the heart of their little island, before slipping out into the darkness. Chloe followed, pulling the door shut behind them. They were in a narrow, dark alley. The sudden roar of the fire from inside the diner was surprisingly loud. It would draw them all. It had to. For a moment, it seemed like the plan had worked. The alley was empty. Freedom was 100-foot dash away. They started to run, their feet pounding on the cracked asphalt. And then, from the darkness ahead of them, at the far end of the alley, a new sound began. It was a soft, melodic humming. A child's nursery rhyme. A small figure stepped out from behind a dumpster, blocking their path. It was the little girl, Maya Miller. She stood there, bathed in the flickering, hellish orange glow from the burning diner, her head tilted, her blank eyes fixed on them. She wasn't alone. Two more figures, tall and silent, emerged from the shadows behind her. The replacements at the front had been the distraction. This was the real trap, and they had just run straight into it. The alley was a trap. The roaring fire at their backs, a hellish orange beacon, illuminated the three silent figures standing before them. The little girl, Maya, stood at the center, her head tilted with an unnerving, doll-like curiosity. The soft, melodic tune she was humming was a sound of pure, nightmarish innocence in a scene of utter terror. The two tall figures behind her were indistinct in the shadows, but their stillness was absolute, their presence a silent, immovable wall blocking the only path to freedom. "They knew," Arthur gasped, his voice a strangled wheeze. "They knew we'd come out the back." "They're hurting us," Chloe breathed, her knuckles white on the handle of the tire iron. Her eyes darted around the narrow alley, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The figures in front of them began to move. They didn't rush. They advanced with the slow, deliberate confidence of predators who have their prey cornered. The humming from the child thing stopped, and the sudden silence was somehow more menacing. There was no way forward. Behind them, the heat from the burning diner was intensifying, the roar of the flames growing louder. They were pinned. Then Chloe saw it. To their left, a 6-foot-high chain-link fence separated the alley from the dark, overgrown backyard of a neighboring house. It was topped with rust and neglect, not barbed wire. It wasn't a wall, but it was an obstacle. A chance. "The fence!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped them. "Now, go!" Action shattered the tense standoff. As Liam and Arthur scrambled for the fence, Chloe turned to face the advancing replacements, swinging the heavy tire iron in a wide, defensive arc to keep them at bay. The fence was cold and unforgiving. The metal links dug into Liam's fingers as he found purchase and began to climb. He could hear the soft, unnervingly quiet scrape of the replacement shoes on the asphalt as Chloe held them off. "Arthur, come on!" Liam urged, reaching the top of the fence and swinging a leg over. The old man was struggling, his movements slow and clumsy with age and terror. He could only get a few feet off the ground before his strength failed him. "I can't," he panted, his face ashen in the firelight. "You have to," Liam insisted, leaning down, offering a hand. Just then, one of the tall replacements lunged past Chloe's guard. It was unnaturally fast. It didn't try to strike or attack. It simply reached out and grabbed Arthur's ankle, its grip like a steel vise. Arthur cried out, a thin, reedy scream of terror as he was anchored to the ground. Without thinking, Liam, perched precariously on top of the fence, kicked downward with his free foot. He connected squarely with the creature's shoulder. The impact jarred his entire leg, but the replacement didn't even grunt. It did, however, loosen its grip for a split second. It was all they needed. "Oh!" Chloe screamed, and while she slammed the tire iron into the creature's arm, Liam grabbed the collar of Arthur's jacket and pulled with every ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength. For a moment, it was a terrifying tug of war. Then, Arthur's foot slipped free. With a final, desperate heave, Liam pulled the old man upward. Chloe abandoned her post and scrambled up the fence with the practiced speed of a squirrel. The three of them tumbled over the top, landing in a painful tangled heap on the other side, in the soft, damp grass of the abandoned yard. They lay there for a second, gasping for air, the smell of smoke and wet earth filling their lungs. Liam looked up. On the other side of the fence, the three replacements had stopped. They stood there, their blank faces illuminated by the growing inferno of the diner, and simply watched. They didn't try to climb. They didn't try to find a way around. They just watched, their objective seemingly complete. They're not following," Liam panted, confused. "They don't have to," Chloe said, getting to her feet and helping a shaken Arthur up. "We're off our route. We're lost. This is exactly what they wanted." She was right. They were standing in a dark, unfamiliar backyard. A rusted swing set sat in the middle of the yard like a skeletal ghost. The house itself was a dark shape, its windows like vacant eyes. They were disoriented, and their planned path to the cannery was now useless. They would have to cut across the town's residential block, navigating a maze of backyards, fences, and dark, empty houses. Their progress was painfully slow. They moved in a low crouch, from one pool of shadow to the next. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh jolt of panic through them. The exhaustion was setting in again, deeper this time. It was a leaden weight in Liam's limbs, a thick fog in his brain. He could feel his body's desperate craving for sleep, a biological betrayal that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Arthur was stumbling more frequently, his breathing ragged and shallow. After what felt like an hour of creeping through the darkness, they finally reached the edge of the residential properties and peered through the slats of a wooden fence onto a new street. "I know this street," Chloe whispered, a hint of relief in her voice. "This is Hemlock Avenue. If we go down 2 blocks, we can cut across Miller's Field. It'll take us right to the cannery." Hope, fragile and tentative, bloomed in Liam's chest. He peered down the length of the dark, silent street. It was empty. The cannery's tall, imposing smokestack was visible in the distance against the moonlit sky. They were going to make it. But then he looked the other way, back towards the center of town. And what he saw made the fragile hope in his chest wither and die. Figures were emerging from the houses and side streets. Not in a single mob, but in small, scattered groups of 2 and 3. They weren't running or giving chase. They were simply taking up positions. One stood at the corner of an intersection. 2 more emerged to stand silently in the middle of a lawn. They were creating a perimeter. They were cutting off all other routes. The fire, the ambush, the chase over the fence. It had all been a beautifully executed feint. It was designed to do one thing, to flush them out and force them onto this single, specific street. They looked back down Hemlock Avenue, the only path that wasn't blocked. It was a straight, open road leading towards their goal. But it no longer felt like an escape route. It felt like a perfectly prepared kill box. They were being driven down a path of the replacement's choosing, and a cold, sickening certainty washed over Liam. The real trap wasn't the one they had just escaped. It was the one they were about to walk into. The realization was a punch to the gut, cold and sickening. Hemlock Avenue wasn't an escape route, it was a runway. A perfectly prepared path designed to funnel them toward an unknown destination. The replacements weren't just hunting them anymore. They were managing them. The thought was infinitely more terrifying than a simple chase. It implied a level of intelligence, of foresight, that turned their desperate struggle for survival into a pawn's hopeless march across a chessboard. "We can't go down there," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling on the edge of a sob. "They're waiting for us." "We can't go back either," Chloe countered, her voice low and tight. She peered through the fence slats back the way they came. More figures were emerging, methodically sealing off the path behind them. "They've left us no other choice. It's a trap, but it's the only way forward." "So we just walk into it?" Liam asked, the sheer insanity of their situation threatening to overwhelm him. "We walk into it with our eyes open," she said, her gaze hardening. "We move fast. We stay low. And we look for a way out. Any way out." There was no other option. With a shared sense of fatalism, they slipped through a gap in the fence and onto the silent, waiting street. The walk down Hemlock Avenue was the longest of Liam's life. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the distant, faint crackle of the diner fire and the soft, rhythmic scuff of their own shoes on the pavement. The houses on either side were dark, their windows like the vacant eyes of skulls. Everything was unervingly perfect. Manicured lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes standing like silent sentinels. It was a suburban dreamscape turned into a waking nightmare. As they moved, they began to see them. A figure stood on a porch, half hidden by a column, perfectly still. Another was visible in a driveway, its form barely illuminated by the moonlight, its head tilted as it watched them pass. They saw a face in an upstairs window, pale and motionless, a portrait of emptiness. They were observers. Jailers on an invisible prison wall. They didn't move to intercept them. They didn't make a sound. They just watched, their silent collective gaze a crushing weight on Liam's soul. The exhaustion, which had been a dull ache, now began to sharpen into a weapon turned against him. His eyelids felt like stones. The edges of his vision started to blur. His mind, starved for rest, began to conjure phantoms in the deep shadows. A hedge seemed to shift. A garden gnome's painted smile seemed to widen into a malevolent sneer. The fight to place one foot in front of the other, to keep his eyes open and his mind clear, became a monumental, all-consuming battle. Arthur was failing. The old man was stumbling, leaning heavily on Chloe for support. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He was a man at the absolute end of his rope, being held together by little more than pure, terrified momentum. They were halfway down the block when the character of the street began to change. Up ahead, a house flickered to life. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the last 50 yards of Hemlock Avenue were blazing with light. Every lamp, every porch light, every single interior light in the last 4 houses on the block was switched on, flooding the street in a harsh, sterile, shadowless glare. And at the very end of the street, sitting squarely in the middle of the intersection under the buzzing glow of a streetlight, was an overturned yellow school bus. It lay on its side like a great, dead animal, its wheels pointing uselessly at the sky. It was the centerpiece, the focal point of the entire, elaborate trap. "What is that? What do they want?" Liam breathed, his tired mind unable to comprehend the bizarre, theatrical scene. "I don't know, and I'm not waiting to find out," Chloe said, her eyes scanning their surroundings frantically. "We're not walking into that light. We have to get off the street. Now." She pointed to the last dark house on their right, just before the brightly lit section began. "There. We go through that house. Through the backyard and into the fields." It was their only chance. They scrambled across the lawn, the grass damp with dew, and huddled in the shadows of the house. The front door was locked. With a grunt, Chloe used the tire iron to pry at a window frame. The wood was old and soft, and it splintered easily. With a soft crack, the lock gave way. She slid the window open. One by one, they slipped inside, into the cool, dusty silence of a home that felt like it had been holding its breath for years. Chloe pulled the window shut behind them. They were in a living room, where all the furniture was draped in white sheets, making the space look like a graveyard of forgotten memories. They moved through the house like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The place felt utterly abandoned, but as they passed through the dining room, Liam noticed something strange. The dust on the large mahogany table had been disturbed. Someone had drawn patterns in it, a series of complex, interlocking circles and lines, a strange and precise geometry. "What is this?" he whispered. "I don't know," Chloe said, her eyes wide. "Just keep moving." They reached the kitchen at the back of the house. It was their way out. The back door was right there, leading to the darkness and the promise of the open fields beyond. But something on the kitchen counter made them all freeze in their tracks. It was a small, makeshift workspace. A map of Havenwood was laid out, marked with the same strange symbols they'd seen in the dust. Next to it lay a stack of family photographs, clearly taken from frames around the house. In every single photo, the faces of the family members, a smiling mother, a proud father, 2 young children, had been meticulously, perfectly excised with a sharp blade, leaving behind nothing but headless, anonymous shapes. Beside the horrifyingly vandalized photos was a single sheet of paper from a notepad. It was a list of names. The first 4 names on the list were the names of the family from the photos, each one neatly crossed out with a single, black line. Underneath, a new heading had been written, pending. Below that heading were 3 names. 3 names that were not crossed out. 3 names that were waiting their turn. Arthur, Chloe, Liam. The world seemed to shrink until it was nothing more than the piece of paper in Chloe's trembling hand. The names, written in a neat, impersonal script, were a death sentence. Arthur, Chloe, Liam. This wasn't a random, chaotic plague. It was a targeted, organized extermination. They were not just fighting for their lives. They were trying to escape a scheduled appointment. The discovery broke something in Arthur. The old man, who had survived years of this terror, who had fought and run and stayed awake through sheer, stubborn will, finally crumpled. A low, guttural sob escaped his lips, a sound of absolute and total despair. He slid down the kitchen cabinets to the floor, his face buried in his shaking hands. The fight was gone. For him, the list was not a threat. It was a verdict that had already been delivered. Chloe stared at the paper, her face a stone mask, but Liam could see the tremor in her hand, the slight widening of her eyes that betrayed the terror beneath. This was personal. This was intimate. Some faceless, soulless thing had sat in this kitchen, in this stolen family's home, and written her name down. For Liam, the sight of his own name on that list was a bizarre and profound violation. They knew him. How could they know him? He was a ghost, a stranger just passing through. His wallet, his driver's license. It was in his car. The thought was chilling. While they were trapped in the diner, one of them must have gone back to his car. They had searched his belongings, learned his name, and added him to their roster. The sheer, cold diligence of it was more terrifying than any monster. How? He whispered, the question directed at no one. They're meticulous, Chloe answered, her voice hollow. She finally dropped the list as if it were burning her hand. They're not just replacing us. They're processing us. This house, this is a workshop. She looked at the photos with the faces cut out, at the strange geometric patterns in the dust. This is what they do. They study the people they're going to take. The air in the house suddenly felt thick, poisonous. They were standing in the belly of the beast, in the creature's den where it prepared its meals. The urge to flee, to get out into the open, was overwhelming. But where could they go? The trap was waiting for them outside. Then, a new sound cut through the stillness. It was the soft, metallic click of a key turning in a lock. It came from the front of the house. A moment later, the front door creaked open with a low, mournful groan. They froze, every muscle tensed. Their blood turned to ice. They hadn't been discovered. They had been waited for. The replacements hadn't bothered trying to break in, because one of them had a key. One of the silent sentinels standing guard on the street had simply come home. Soft, nearly silent footsteps padded into the house. One person. It moved with a slow, unhurried confidence. It was home. The basement, Chloe mouthed, her eyes wide with panic. It was their only conceivable option. To go out the back door now would be suicide. They would be seen instantly. Their only chance was to disappear, to melt into the shadows of the house itself. She pointed to a door near the pantry. Arthur, still slumped on the floor, looked up, his eyes glassy with despair. He shook his head, a silent refusal to move. He had given up. There was no time to argue. Liam grabbed one of the old man's arms, Chloe grabbed the other, and they hauled him to his feet. They practically dragged the unresisting, dead weight of him to the basement door. The footsteps from the front of the house stopped, as if listening. Then, they began to move again, a soft, shuffling sound on the old carpet, heading towards the dining room, towards the kitchen, towards them. Chloe twisted the old glass knob of the basement door. It opened with a groan that sounded deafeningly loud in the tense silence. A wave of cool, musty air, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, washed over them. One by one, they slipped through the doorway and onto the rickety wooden steps, pulling the door shut behind them, plunging themselves into near total blackness. The basement was a claustrophobic nightmare. The air was heavy and hard to breathe. Shapes of forgotten furniture, old boxes, and hanging tools loomed in the gloom. They huddled together at the bottom of the stairs, hidden behind an old, overturned furnace, their bodies pressed against the cold, damp concrete. Above them, they could hear everything. The footsteps entered the kitchen, slow and methodical. There was a pause. Liam imagined the creature standing over the counter, looking at the photos, at the list with their names on it. He imagined it seeing the disturbance, knowing they were there. The footsteps moved around the kitchen. The soft scrape of a chair being pulled out. The creak of a floorboard. The creature was searching. It was hunting. Huddled in the darkness, the exhaustion washed over Liam with the force of a tidal wave. The cold, the dark, the rhythmic creaking from upstairs, it was all a monstrous lullaby. His eyelids began to droop. He fought it, digging his fingernails into his palms, the sharp pain a tiny anchor in a sea of fatigue. Beside him, he could hear Arthur's breathing, a ragged, hitching sound that was dangerously close to a sob. If he made a sound, they were dead. The footsteps upstairs stopped. They stopped directly above the basement door. Liam held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear Chloe's shallow, rapid breathing next to him. A profound, terrifying silence stretched for what felt like an hour. Then, the old glass doorknob on the basement door began to turn, its mechanism groaning in the quiet. A sliver of light from the kitchen cut through the darkness as the door began to creak open. It widened, casting a long rectangular beam of light down the wooden stairs, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The beam fell just inches from their hiding spot. A silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs, a dark, human shape against the light of the kitchen. It stood there, motionless, its head tilted slightly as it peered down into the oppressive gloom where the three of them were huddled, utterly silent, utterly trapped. The hunt was over. They had been found. The silhouette at the top of the stairs was a statue carved from shadow and dread. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, a silent sentinel guarding the only exit from their subterranean tomb, its presence radiating a cold, predatory patience. The light from the kitchen behind it was a cruel joke, illuminating their helplessness, casting the long shadow of their executioner down the stairs towards them. Liam felt his lungs burn, the need for oxygen a screaming battle against the instinct to remain utterly silent. Beside him, he could feel Chloe's muscles coiled tight, ready to spring, the tire iron a useless totem clutched in her hands. Then, the figure moved. It took a single, deliberate step down onto the old wooden staircase. The step groaned under its weight, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the basement. The light caught the figure's face. It was a woman, middle-aged, with a soft, unremarkable face framed by graying hair. A face that belonged on a Christmas card, not in a nightmare. "Mrs. Gable," Chloe breathed, her voice so quiet it was barely a vibration in the air. "She lived here. She taught my younger sister piano." The thing that wore Mrs. Gable's face took another step down, its movements unervingly smooth and silent. Its blank, placid eyes scanned the darkness, and Liam had the horrifying certainty that it could see them perfectly, that their hiding place behind the old furnace was as obvious as if they were standing in a spotlight. The sight of his former neighbor, of a kind woman who gave out the best candy on Halloween, now transformed into this hollowed-out thing, was the final straw for Arthur. A choked, terrified whimper escaped his lips. It was a tiny sound, a mouse's cry, but in the profound stillness of the basement, it was a thunderclap. The head of the Gable thing snapped in their direction. The hunt was over. It knew exactly where they were. It abandoned its slow, methodical descent and launched itself down the remaining stairs, its arms outstretched, its fingers curled like claws. But in that same instant, Liam's mind, sharpened by terror and exhaustion, found a desperate, suicidal solution. While Chloe instinctively moved to intercept the creature, Liam's eyes darted to the far wall, to the old, rust-stained metal box with a thick bundle of wires running into it. The main breaker panel. "The lights!" Liam yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm killing the lights!" He scrambled from their hiding place, his feet slipping on the damp concrete floor. Behind him, he heard the sickening thud of the tire iron meeting flesh, followed by a grunt of effort from Chloe. There was no cry of pain from the creature. Liam reached the breaker box and tore open the metal door with a screech of protesting hinges. Inside was a chaotic array of black switches, a complex electrical nervous system he didn't understand. There was no time to think. As he heard Chloe cry out, a sound of pain this time, he balled up his fist and slammed it across the entire row of breakers. The world vanished. The single beam of light from the kitchen winked out of existence. The low hum of electricity died. They were plunged into a darkness so absolute, so profound, it felt like being smothered in black velvet. It was a total sensory deprivation. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The sounds of the struggle stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged, panicked breathing, his, Chloe's, Arthur's. Then, a soft, shuffling sound from the direction of the stairs. The creature was disoriented, but not disabled. Upstairs. "Now, Chloe's voice hissed from the darkness to his left. It was a blind, terrifying scramble. Liam felt his way along the cold, damp wall, his hands outstretched, until he bumped into Arthur. He grabbed the old man's arm and pulled him along. They stumbled toward the memory of where the stairs had been. Liam's foot hit the first step, and he began to climb, pulling Arthur with him. He could hear Chloe right behind them. He could also hear another set of soft, shuffling footsteps beginning to follow them up from the basement floor. It was adapting to the darkness faster than they were. They burst out of the basement and into the equally black kitchen, stumbling, disoriented. "Back door," Chloe urged, her voice a beacon in the oppressive dark. They fumbled their way across the room, bumping into counters, their hands searching frantically for the door. Liam's fingers found the cool metal of the doorknob. He twisted it, pulled, and a wave of cool, fresh night air washed over them. They spilled out into the backyard, into the faint, silvery light of the moon, and collapsed onto the damp grass, their lungs heaving. They were out. They were free. But their relief lasted only for a second. A single light flickered on in the house they had just escaped. Then another. The creature inside had found the breaker box. But it didn't just turn on the kitchen light. Every single light in the gable house blazed to life, flooding the backyard in an intense, sterile glare. And it didn't stop there. Down the street, in the next house, the lights flashed on. Then the next. In a silent, cascading wave, every dark house on Hemlock Avenue lit up, one after another, as if a single invisible hand were flipping a master switch. The entire street, which had been a haven of shadow, was now a corridor of brilliant, shadowless light. There was nowhere left to hide. Liam looked up, his heart sinking into a cold, dark abyss in his stomach. The plan had been to cross the backyard and disappear into the fields. But the fields were now illuminated, as bright as day. And they were no longer empty. From the back doors of the surrounding houses, figures began to emerge. From the alleyways and the side streets, more of them appeared. The silent sentinels, the patient observers, were no longer watching. Their observation was over. They were moving now, converging on the single, brightly lit backyard where Liam, Chloe, and Arthur stood, exposed and utterly trapped. The entire town had become a stage, and they were the only actors left. This was checkmate. The sudden, overwhelming cascade of light banished every shadow, every hope of concealment. Liam, Chloe, and Arthur stood frozen in the center of the brightly lit backyard, flies caught in the amber of 100 merciless floodlights. From every direction, the replacements were emerging. They poured from the back doors of the houses. They stepped out from the alleys, their numbers far greater than Liam had ever imagined. The entire surviving population of the town's silent predators was converging on this single point. On them. They didn't run or shout. Their advance was a slow, inexorable tide of silent bodies. The circle tightened, their blank, placid faces illuminated from a dozen different angles, their expressions unreadable, inhuman. It wasn't a frenzied attack, it was a calm, methodical collection. "Back to the house," Chloe commanded, her voice tight but steady. "Get against the wall. Don't let them surround us." They scrambled backward until their backs were pressed against the cold aluminum siding of the gable house. It was a pitiful defense, a last, desperate stand against an overwhelming force. Chloe stood slightly in front, the tire iron held in a two-handed grip. Liam stood beside her, his hands balled into useless fists. Arthur had slumped to the ground, his eyes closed, muttering a quiet, broken prayer. He was done. The circle of replacements shrank. 20 feet. 15. 10. Liam could see the individual details on their faces now. The vacant eyes of Mrs. Gable, the chillingly placid expression of the David Miller thing, the blank, doll-like face of the child, Maya. He could smell the faint, ozonic, sterile scent that seemed to cling to them. The air grew heavy, the silence absolute, save for Arthur's quiet weeping. This was the end. A quiet, anonymous death, to be replaced by a hollow shell. Then, a new sensation. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling, a low, subsonic vibration that seemed to resonate deep in his bones, making his teeth hum. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Every single replacement stopped. In perfect, unnerving unison, their advance halted. Their heads, as if pulled by a single invisible string, all turned away from the trio. They were no longer looking at their cornered prey. They were looking down the length of Hemlock Avenue, towards the intersection, towards the overturned school bus. The bus had begun to glow. A sickly pale blue light pulsed from within the wreck, spilling out of its shattered windows. The light was faint at first, then grew in intensity until the entire bus was a beacon of eerie, otherworldly luminescence. The humming intensified with the light, becoming a clear, audible, and deeply hypnotic drone. The replacements were transfixed. Their mission, their hunt, was forgotten, overridden by a new, more powerful directive. Their blank faces were bathed in the strange blue light, their expressions still empty, but their focus now absolute. "What is happening?" Liam whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. "I don't know," Chloe breathed beside him, her knuckles still white on the tire iron. "But it's our chance." The circle of bodies that had been a solid, inescapable wall was now a porous ring of distracted sentinels. Their path was no longer blocked. "Go," she urged, her voice a sharp hiss. "Towards the fields. Don't run. Walk. Quietly. Don't draw attention." It was the most terrifying walk of Liam's life, more so than the walk down the gauntlet of Hemlock Avenue. They had to move through the ranks of the replacements, brushing past the silent, unmoving bodies of their former neighbors. The creatures didn't even seem to register their presence. Their stolen eyes were locked on the glowing, humming bus, their focus so complete that the world around them had ceased to exist. Liam could feel the vibrations from the bus in the soles of his feet as he walked. They slipped past the last of the figures and broke into a desperate, stumbling run across the brightly lit field. The ground was uneven, and Arthur fell twice, his frail body unable to keep up. Each time, Liam and Chloe hauled him back to his feet, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning. They didn't dare look back until they reached the dark tree line on the other side of the field, at the edge of the riverbank. They collapsed into the cover of the woods, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. They had survived. It felt impossible, a miracle born of some strange, incomprehensible machine. From their new vantage point, they had a clear view of the scene they had just fled. The entire town was lit up like a circuit board, and at its center, the school bus pulsed with its eerie, rhythmic light. The replacements were no longer standing still. They were moving. Slowly, reverently, they began to walk towards the bus. From every street and every house, they came. A silent, shuffling pilgrimage towards their glowing, humming god. They formed a massive concentric circle around the wreck, their faces tilted upward, basking in its strange radiance. It's calling them," Liam said, the pieces falling into a new, more terrifying pattern. "They're not just individuals. They're a hive. And that's the nest." The cannery, their planned fortress, was just a short distance down the riverbank. It was still their only hope for a secure shelter, a place to rest, to survive until sunrise. But as Liam stared at the bizarre, unholy ceremony taking place across the field, the thought of hiding felt wrong. Insufficient. They had been running and hiding all night. They had seen their friends and neighbors turned into monsters. They had been hunted, herded, and marked for death. But now, for the first time, they were seeing something more. They were seeing the heart of the enemy. "We were going to hide in the cannery," Liam said, his voice quiet but firm, filled with a new, strange resolve born of sheer terror and a desperate need for answers. "But what's the point? This will all just happen again tomorrow night. And the night after that." Chloe looked at him, then back at the pulsing blue light. He could see the same thought reflected in her exhausted, haunted eyes. Hiding wasn't a solution. It was just a delay. "That thing," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper, "whatever is in that bus, that's the answer. That's the only thing that matters." Their desperate flight for survival was over. A new, terrifying, and possibly suicidal mission was just beginning. They had to stop running from the storm. They had to walk into its eye. The sanctuary of the dark woods was a temporary, fragile thing. Liam, Chloe, and Arthur lay hidden in the brush, the cool, damp earth a stark contrast to the frantic heat of their flight. Below them, across the wide, brightly lit field, the bizarre spectacle continued. The town of Havenwood, their prison, was laid out like a circuit board, and all its energy, all its focus, was directed at the pulsing blue heart of the overturned school bus. The low, resonant hum was a constant presence, a sound that vibrated in their teeth and settled deep in their chests, a hymn for the soulless. "We have to go. Now," Arthur rasped, his voice raw with terror. He was already trying to get to his feet, his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the cannery down the riverbank. "We get inside the cannery. We hide. We wait for the sun. It's the only way." "And then what, Arthur?" Liam asked, his own voice quiet but intense. He couldn't take his eyes off the bus. "What happens tomorrow night?" "We hide again. And the night after that." "We saw the list. They're not just stumbling around in the dark. They're hunting us. Hiding is just delaying the inevitable. Delaying is better than dying." Arthur shot back, a hysterical edge to his voice. "Are you insane, boy? Look at that thing. That's their church, their nest, their queen. Whatever it is, it's the center of their world. Going anywhere near it is suicide. We survived. Let that be enough. He was right. Every survival instinct Liam possessed screamed at him to agree, to run to the cannery and bolt the door. But the image of his own name on that list, of the blank-eyed man in the old photograph, had changed something in him. They weren't just victims of a random plague. They were targets of an ancient, patient enemy. And that enemy had just revealed its heart. "He's right, Arthur," Chloe said softly. Arthur and Liam both turned to look at her. Her face was a mask of utter exhaustion, but her eyes held a new, hard light. For 3 years, she had done nothing but survive. She had played by the rules, endured the endless nights, and watched her world shrink to the 4 walls of a diner. The rage that had been simmering beneath her fear for so long was finally boiling over. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I'm tired of hiding. For 3 years, we've been the mice, and they've been the cats. But that thing," she gestured toward the bus, "that thing is a weakness. They were about to take us, and it called them off. They are slaves to it. If we can understand it, maybe we can fight it. Maybe we can actually end this." Arthur stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and betrayal. "You'd listen to him? A stranger? Over me? I'm listening to the part of me that's sick of being afraid," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "We're not going to the bus now. That would be suicide. You're right. We're going to the cannery. We're going to get inside, get secure, and get to a high vantage point. We're not going to hide. We're going to watch. We are going to learn." Her plan was a compromise, a bridge between Arthur's terror and Liam's reckless resolve. It was the only thing that made sense. Arthur, seeing he was outvoted, let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh, and fell silent. He would follow, but his hope was gone. The journey to the cannery was a short but nerve-wracking trek along the dark, muddy riverbank. The humming from the bus was their constant companion. The building loomed before them, a massive, decaying brick monolith silhouetted against the night sky. It was a fortress, but a dead one. The main loading dock doors were chained and padlocked, the rust thick as bark. "Around the side," Chloe whispered. "There's a maintenance access ladder." They found it on the north wall, a rusted iron ladder leading up 20 feet to a small, broken window. It was their only way in. "I'll go first," Liam said. "Make sure it's clear." The climb was treacherous. The cold metal rungs were slick with moisture, and the whole structure groaned under his weight. He pulled himself up to the window. The glass was shattered, leaving a jagged opening just big enough to squeeze through. He peered inside. Darkness. The only sounds were the drip of water and the faint, muffled hum from outside. He slipped through the opening, landing softly on a metal catwalk inside. The air was thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. He shone his phone's weak flashlight into the cavernous space below. Vast, silent machines sat like sleeping iron beasts, draped in decades of dust and cobwebs. The place was a tomb. "It's clear," he called down in a loud whisper. Getting Arthur up was a nightmare. The old man was weak and terrified of the height. It took both Liam pulling from above and Chloe pushing from below to get him to the top. Finally, panting and shaking, all 3 of them stood on the catwalk inside the cannery. They were in. They spent the next 20 minutes in a tense, hurried sweep of the upper levels. They found the main breaker and, miraculously, the lights in the administrative offices still worked. They located the office with the best view, a corner room with large, grimy windows that looked directly out over Hemlock Avenue and the intersection. From their new perch, the scene was laid out before them like a tactical map. The pulsing blue bus, the silent, worshipping army of the replacements, the entire town lit up and on display. "What now?" Arthur asked, his voice hollow as he slumped into a dusty chair. "Now," Chloe said, her eyes fixed on the bus. "We watch." As if on cue, the scene below began to change. The blue light from the bus flared, becoming brighter, and the hum intensified for a moment. A section of the bus's side panel slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, revealing a dark, square opening. One of the replacements detached itself from the silent, watching crowd. It was the Mrs. Gable thing. She walked with her same placid, smooth gait towards the open hatch. Without hesitation, she climbed inside and disappeared into the bus. Liam, Chloe, and Arthur watched, holding their breath. What was happening in there? Was it a recharge? A debriefing? A minute later, the woman emerged. But she was different. Her placid movements were gone. Her body was racked with tiny, constant tremors, her head twitching in small, bird-like jerks. Her hands were no longer empty. In her right hand, she held a small metallic object that glinted in the blue light, a long, thin rod that looked something like a medical instrument. The upgraded Mrs. Gablething turned and walked back to her spot in the crowd, her movements now faster, sharper, and filled with a new, twitching energy. The hatch on the bus hissed shut. The light returned to its steady, rhythmic pulse. The three survivors stared from their high window, a new, cold dread seeping into them. The bus wasn't just a beacon. It was a workshop. A place where the replacements were being altered, armed, and improved. And they had no idea what for. The transformation of the Mrs. Gablething sent a shockwave of cold dread through their small group. It was one thing to fight a known enemy, a predictable, slow-moving predator. It was another thing entirely to watch that enemy evolve before their eyes. The twitching, energized movements, the glint of the metallic rod, it was a horrifying upgrade. They weren't just being replaced, they were being rendered obsolete. "They're getting stronger," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. He sank back into the dusty office chair, the last of his fight seemingly extinguished. "While we hide, they're arming themselves. We have no chance. No chance at all." "No," Chloe said, her voice a low, furious growl. The sight had not broken her. It had forged her fear into a sharp, angry resolve. "We're not going to sit here and watch them prepare for us. We're not going to wait until they all have one of those things. The sun will be up in a couple of hours. That's our window." "A window to do what, Chloe?" Liam asked, his mind racing. "We can't fight that. Not all of them." "We don't fight them," she said, turning away from the window, her eyes burning with a desperate, dangerous idea. "We fight it." She pointed a trembling finger at the pulsing blue bus. "That's the brain. That's the factory. We saw what the fire alarm did. A loud noise messes them up. If we can create a big enough distraction, maybe we can get to the bus." Arthur shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "A distraction? Child, they have the whole town surrounded. There are 100 of them out there. We're trapped. It's hopeless." "He's right, we're trapped," Liam agreed, "but he's wrong that it's hopeless." The gears were turning in his head, connecting Chloe's desperate anger with a new possibility. "We're not trapped in a prison. We're trapped in an armory." He looked around the office, then out at the vast, dark factory floor below them. "This place, it's not just a fortress. It's a factory. There have to be tools, chemicals, something we can use. Something bigger than a fire alarm." A new energy surged through them, or at least through Liam and Chloe. Arthur remained in his chair, a monument to despair. Leaving him for a moment, they descended from the offices to the main cannery floor, their small flashlight beams cutting through the monolithic darkness. The factory was a sleeping giant. Conveyor belts snaked through the space like metal rivers, and giant, silent canning machines stood like ancient, multi-limbed idols. In a maintenance locker, they found a treasure trove, a heavy-duty crowbar, a pair of massive pipe wrenches, and a full emergency flare kit. In a chemical storage closet, they found drums of industrial cleaning solvents, their flammable warning labels peeling with age. But their most significant discovery was in the heart of the building, the boiler room. It was a cavernous space of iron and steam, dominated by a massive, ancient boiler. And on the wall was a large, greasy wheel connected to a network of pipes that led to the roof. "The shift whistle," Chloe breathed, her eyes wide with a manic brilliance. "My grandpa used to complain about it. Said you could hear it in the next county. It hasn't been used in 20 years. She ran a hand over the boiler. It was cold, but it was intact. The gas lines to this place were never shut off. If we can get this thing fired up, get some pressure in the tank, the sound would be 1,000 times louder than that diner alarm." It was a plan born of pure insanity, a symphony of destruction. The whistle would be the distraction, a sound loud enough to hopefully stun every replacement in a half-mile radius. While they were disoriented, she and Liam would make a run for the bus. Arthur, too frail to make the run, would have the most important job. When the time was right, he would be the one to turn the wheel and unleash the sound. They spent the next hour in a frantic, grease-stained frenzy. Liam, remembering fragments from a high school physics class, figured out the boiler's ignition sequence. Chloe, who had a knack for all things mechanical, managed to clear the blockages in the gas line. The old machine groaned and hissed, but slowly, monstrously, it began to come to life. A low rumble started deep in its iron belly as the pilot light caught and the burners roared to life. The pressure gauge, its glass cracked and yellowed, began to tremble, its needles slowly, painstakingly, creeping into the green. As they waited for the pressure to build, they took a moment, huddled in the relative warmth of the boiler room. The exhaustion was a physical pain now, a crushing weight that made every thought a struggle. "Are we really doing this?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper, the reality of their suicide mission crashing down on him. "We have to," Chloe said. She wouldn't meet his eyes, instead staring at the trembling needle on the pressure gauge. I can't face another sunrise knowing this is just going to start all over again. I'd rather die trying to end it than live another day hiding from it." Liam nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He felt the same way. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but now it was mixed with a strange, defiant fire. He was no longer just a victim. He was a participant. They left Arthur in the boiler room, his hand resting on the large, cold wheel of the steam whistle. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He knew his part. Liam and Chloe made their way to the main loading dock doors. Using the new crowbar, they managed to pry one of the massive sliding doors open just a crack, enough to see out. Their view was perfect. The field, the street, and the pulsing blue bus. The silent army still stood in worship. Chloe held a small walkie-talkie from the emergency kit. She had given the other to Arthur. She took a deep breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the radio. She looked at Liam, a world of fear and resolve passing between them in a single glance. They were out of time. They were out of options. She raised the walkie-talkie to her lips. "Arthur," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Do it now." Liam watched Arthur's face in his mind's eye. He saw the old man's terrified, determined expression. He saw his trembling hands close around the cold iron wheel, and he braced himself for the sound that would either save them or be the last thing they ever heard. The command from Chloe's walkie-talkie crackled in the cavernous boiler room, a tiny tinny sound in the immense waiting silence. For a heartbeat, Arthur didn't move. He stood before the giant iron wheel, a frail, terrified man tasked with waking a god of sound and iron. Then, with a shuddering breath that was half sob, half prayer, he gripped the wheel with both hands and turned. The sound that erupted from the roof of the cannery was not a whistle. It was a physical assault. It was a deep, primordial shriek of pressurized steam, a sound from the very dawn of the industrial age, a cataclysm of noise that tore through the quiet night. It shook the cannery to its foundations, rattling the windows in their frames and sending cascades of rust and dust down from the high ceiling. Even expecting it, Liam and Chloe were staggered, their hands flying to their ears as the sound hammered into them, a physical, vibrating force that seemed to liquefy the air itself. Outside, the effect was apocalyptic. Through the crack in the loading dock door, they watched the scene of silent worship shatter into chaos. The army of replacements, which had been standing in placid hypnotic reverence, was instantly and violently overwhelmed. Their collective trance broke. Their bodies went rigid, their heads snapping back. One by one, then in waves, they began to collapse, falling to the ground as if their strings had been cut. They weren't still. Their limbs twitched and jerked in violent, uncontrolled spasms, their bodies contorting on the brightly lit grass. The fire alarm had stunned them. This was crucifying them. Even the bus itself seemed to react. The steady, pulsing blue light flickered and stuttered, and the low, resonant hum it emitted was drowned out by the titanic, shrieking wave of the steam whistle. "It's working," Chloe yelled, her voice barely audible even right next to Liam's ear. "It's working. Let's go." She shoved the heavy door open, and they burst out into the vibrating, sound-ravaged night. The field before them was a surreal hellscape. It was littered with the writhing, spasming bodies of the replacements, a silent, synchronized dance of agony. They sprinted across the open ground, their boots dodging the flailing limbs of their former neighbors. Liam's eyes caught the twitching form of the Maya thing, her small body convulsing on the ground, and he had to choke back a wave of nausea. As they ran, Liam noticed that not all the replacements were completely incapacitated. A few of them, including the David Miller thing and the upgraded Mrs. Gable, were not on the ground. They were on their hands and knees, their bodies trembling violently, but they were fighting it. Their heads were slowly, painfully, turning toward the bus. They were trying to crawl, to drag themselves toward their wounded god, their programming overriding the agony. They were stronger than the others. They reached the street, the overturned bus looming before them like the carcass of a great beast. The shrieking whistle was an unrelenting physical pressure. Liam's teeth ached, and his vision was blurring at the edges. They had to be fast. The hatch on the side of the bus was sealed shut. "The crowbar!" Chloe shouted, and together they wedged the tip of the heavy steel bar into the seam of the hatch. They threw their entire weight against it. The metal groaned. It was sealed tight. Behind them, Liam could hear the scraping sound of one of the stronger replacements dragging itself across the pavement toward them. They were running out of time. Again. Chloe yelled, and they heaved, their muscles screaming. With a loud metallic crack, the lock gave way. The hatch popped open with a hiss of decompressing air. They tore it open and stared inside. The interior of the bus was not a bus. The seats, the aisle, the driver's wheel, it was all gone. The walls were coated in a thick, pulsating web of glowing blue fibers that looked disturbingly like a nervous system. In the center of the space, a pillar of what looked like black, obsidian-like crystal rose from the floor to the ceiling, the source of the blue light. The air inside was cool and hummed with a strange, clean energy that felt completely alien. It was the bridge of a spaceship crammed into the shell of a school bus. Without a second thought, they scrambled inside, hauling themselves through the hatchway. The moment they were inside, the overwhelming shriek of the steam whistle was instantly muffled, replaced by the deep, internal, and strangely melodic hum of the bus itself. It was a sound that seemed to resonate not in their ears, but directly inside their skulls. They stood there for a moment, disoriented, in the heart of the enemy. Wires and the strange, organic fibers pulsed with light all around them. The black crystal pillar in the center of the room seemed to absorb the light, its depths infinite. They had made it. But now what? Smash the pillar? Cut the wires? As they stood there, tools in hand, trying to formulate a plan, the humming inside the bus suddenly changed its pitch. It shifted from a low, steady drone to a series of soft, inquisitive chimes. The light from the central pillar intensified, and on its smooth black surface, a new pattern of blue light began to form. It was not random. It was a complex, geometric shape, a perfect, intricate lattice of light that resolved itself before their eyes. The bus was aware of them. It was a living, thinking machine, and it had just turned its full, silent, and ancient attention directly upon them. They weren't just intruders anymore. They were subjects of a terrifying, silent inquiry. The inside of the bus was a pocket of alien reality stitched into the fabric of the world. The deafening shriek of the steam whistle was gone, replaced by a low, melodic hum that was more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to tune the very atoms of the air. Liam and Chloe stood on a floor that felt strangely soft and organic, surrounded by pulsating, fibrous blue veins that coated every surface. Before them, the black crystal pillar pulsed with a soft, intelligent light, the source of the hum, the brain of the hive. The intricate geometric pattern of light that had formed on the crystal surface began to shift and warp. The melodic chimes in their skulls intensified. It wasn't an attack, it was an intrusion. Liam felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as if his memories were being rifled through like pages in a book. He saw flashes of his childhood home, the face of his mother, the cramped dorm room he'd left just that morning. It was a cold, dispassionate curiosity, a machine trying to understand the data of his life. He gritted his teeth, fighting the mental violation. Beside him, he could see Chloe struggling as well, her face pale, her eyes unfocused. The machine was trying to pacify them, to understand them, to categorize them before it dealt with them. A crackle from the walkie-talkie on Chloe's belt cut through the trance. "Chloe, Liam can't hold it." Arthur's voice was a weak, static-laced gasp. "Pressure failing." The sound of Arthur's voice, a lifeline to the human world, was the jolt they needed. Chloe's eyes snapped back into focus, her expression hardening. "Liam, now!" she yelled, her voice breaking the spell. She raised the heavy tire iron. Liam hefted the crowbar. The lullaby was over. They were here to kill a god. They charged forward, swinging their makeshift weapons at the central crystal. The moment their intent became clear, the bus reacted. The melodic hum instantly became a discordant, angry shriek. The blue light flared, turning a violent, aggressive red. As Chloe's tire iron descended, a thick, vein-like cable whipped out from the wall, moving with serpentine speed. It wrapped around the tire iron and yanked it from her grasp, sending it clattering uselessly to the far side of the bus. Liam's attack, however, found its mark. He brought the crowbar down with all his strength, the pointed end aimed at the heart of the crystal. The impact created a sound like shattering stars. A network of brilliant white cracks instantly spiderwebbed across the pillar's smooth, black surface. The effect was system-wide and catastrophic. The red light inside the bus flickered violently. The angry shriek became a pained, grinding wail of dying machinery. A shower of blue sparks rained down from the ceiling. And outside, the connection was severed. The steam whistle was already starting to sputter, its shriek weakening, but the effect of the damaged crystal was far more profound. The replacements, who had just begun to stir and fight through the sonic assault, froze. Their inner light, the faint blue glow that seemed to animate them, flickered out. In perfect unison, the entire army of them went limp, their bodies collapsing to the ground like discarded marionettes. They weren't twitching. They weren't spasming. They were just off. Inert heaps of flesh and cloth. Inside the bus, a new sound began, a high-pitched, rapidly escalating whine. The air grew intensely hot. The cracked crystal began to glow white, the light too bright to look at. "It's going to blow!" Liam yelled, shielding his eyes. "We have to get out!" They scrambled for the hatch, the floor vibrating violently beneath their feet. They tumbled out onto the street, falling onto the hard pavement, and scrambled away from the dying machine. The steam whistle on the cannery finally gave out, its last gasp of steam hissing into the sudden, profound silence. They had done it. They had actually done it. The replacements were down. The bus was dying. They had won. But their victory was a fleeting, naive dream. As the whine from within the bus reached an unbearable crescendo, it didn't explode. Instead, with a final, deafening boom, all the light and sound from it simply ceased. A wave of force, like a silent thunderclap, washed over the street, and then nothing. The bus was just a dark, silent, overturned wreck. Liam and Chloe lay on the pavement, their ears ringing, their bodies bruised and battered, staring at the inert bodies of their former enemies. It was over. Then, from the rear of the silent bus, a new sound began. The grinding of gears, the hiss of hydraulics. A heavy, reinforced panel that looked like an emergency exit was being forced open from the inside. This was not the panicked escape of a wounded animal. It was the deliberate, unhurried emergence of something that had been disturbed. The panel fell away with a heavy clang. From the dark, smoking interior, a figure emerged. It was not a copy of a human. It was tall and slender, its body a disturbing fusion of dark, chitinous plating and bundles of glowing, blue, fibrous muscle. It had too many joints in its long, thin limbs, and its head was a smooth, featureless ovoid that tilted with an insect-like curiosity. It was the pilot, the intelligence, the true form of the thing that had been hiding inside its mechanical shell. It unfolded itself to its full, terrifying height, standing over the street littered with its deactivated puppets. It turned its featureless head, and Liam felt a gaze that was ancient, cold, and utterly alien settle upon him and Chloe. They hadn't killed the beast. They had just kicked it out of its nest. And now, for the first time, it was going to deal with them itself. The creature that unfolded from the wreckage of the bus was a thing of impossible geometry. It was a nightmare of smooth, dark plating and glowing, fibrous muscle, and it moved with a silent, liquid grace that was utterly alien. It stood in the center of the street, a silent, slender god amidst the field of its fallen puppets, and it turned its featureless, ovoid head to face them. Liam and Chloe scrambled backward, their bruised and battered bodies screaming in protest. The crowbar and tire iron felt like children's toys in the face of this thing. There was no fighting it. This was the intelligence, the architect of their misery, and it had been flushed from its sanctuary. It didn't attack. Instead, it reached out, not with its long, multi-jointed limbs, but with its mind. The world dissolved. The street, the bodies, the smoking bus, it all vanished, replaced by a torrent of images and sensations that poured directly into Liam's consciousness. He saw galaxies being born and dying in an instant. He saw sterile, perfectly ordered cities of crystal and light. He saw a cold, logical justification for the horror that had befallen Havenwood. Disorder, a voice that was not a voice, echoed in his mind. It was a pure concept, a cold block of logic. Your species is chaotic. Your sleep is a flaw, a vulnerability, a waste. We bring order. We bring efficiency. We bring purpose. The entity showed him a vision of a perfected humanity. Silent, efficient beings moving in perfect synchronicity, their minds linked, their purpose singular. There was no pain, no fear, no grief. But there was also no love, no laughter, no art, no dreams. It was the peace of the grave. He felt the creature sifting through his own memories, dismissing his fear and love as flawed, chaotic data. It was trying to show him the futility of his struggle, the logical superiority of its own existence. But as it dug, it hit something it didn't understand. It hit the raw, chaotic, and utterly illogical memory of Chloe swinging the tire iron in the Miller house, not out of strategy, but out of pure protective rage. It hit the memory of Arthur's terrified, heartbroken sob in the basement. It hit the memory of Liam, a total stranger, pulling that old man over the fence, an act of selfless, inefficient risk. "Chloe," Liam gasped, staggering under the psychic assault. "It doesn't understand." Chloe was on one knee, her face pale, her knuckles pressed against her temples. It thinks we're just data." "So let's give it some data it can't process," Liam said, a wild, desperate idea blooming in his mind. "Don't fight it. Don't block it. Push." He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in defiance. He stopped trying to resist the creature's mental intrusion. Instead, he opened the floodgates. He focused on every messy, painful, glorious, and illogical piece of himself. He threw the memory of his first scraped knee at it, the illogical terror of a monster under his bed. He threw the memory of his first kiss at it, a clumsy, awkward, and beautiful moment of pure, inefficient emotion. He threw the terror of the last 12 hours at it, the smell of the burning diner, the sound of the splintering pantry door. Beside him, Chloe understood. She let out a low, ragged cry and did the same. She pushed 3 years of raw, undiluted grief for her lost friends and family. She pushed a burning, white-hot rage at the theft of her town, her life, her future. She pushed the simple, cherished memory of her mother's smile. It was a tidal wave of pure, chaotic humanity. A cacophony of grief, hope, fear, love, and rage. The creature recoiled. The perfect, logical images in their minds shattered. The voice of pure concept shrieked, not in pain, but in confusion, in system error. The smooth, chitinous plates on its body began to shift and tremble. The blue light of its fibrous muscles flickered erratically, turning a corrupted, staticky red. This raw, human chaos was a virus to its orderly, logical mind. It was a paradox it could not solve. A crackle came from Chloe's walkie-talkie, a small, tinny voice cutting through the psychic storm. Chloe! Liam! The sun is coming up. Arthur's voice. A fragile thread of hope from a broken old man who hadn't given up. That final, illogical piece of data, the stubborn hope of a human who should have been crushed by despair, was the final blow. The creature let out a silent, mental scream. Its physical form began to destabilize. It folded in on itself, its long limbs retracting, its body warping and twisting as if being pulled through an unseen dimension. It did not die. It simply fled. It retreated from a reality that was too messy, too chaotic, and too painfully human for it to comprehend. With a final, silent implosion, it was gone. Liam and Chloe collapsed onto the pavement, the psychic assault vanishing as quickly as it had begun. They lay there, utterly and completely spent, their minds and bodies scoured clean. The street was silent. The bus was a dead, dark husk. And on the eastern horizon, the first brilliant rays of the morning sun crested the hills. As the warm, golden light washed over the street, the inert bodies of the replacements began to change. They shimmered, then dissolved, breaking down into a fine gray ash that was caught by the morning breeze and scattered into nothingness. The town, in the light of the new day, was being cleansed. They lay there for a long time, just watching the sky turn from orange to brilliant blue. Soon, a single shuffling figure appeared at the far end of the street, walking slowly from the direction of the cannery. It was Arthur. He was alive. Liam looked at Chloe, her face streaked with grime, but finally, for the first time since he'd met her, relaxed. The exhaustion he had been fighting all night, the great, monstrous enemy, was no longer a threat. It was a release. A reward. The only rule in Havenwood had been broken. The curse was lifted. He felt the immense, gentle weight of true, earned fatigue settle over him. He was safe. They were all safe. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, warming his face, Liam finally closed his eyes and allowed himself to fall asleep.